On Tuesday, February 11, 1997, Le Portel, a small town on the southern coast of Boulogne-sur-Mer, was celebrating its carnival for 3 days. The festival was in full swing, and tonight was the last night that everyone was eagerly anticipating. The Merlin sisters, Peggy and Amélie, had never missed it. Today, they invited their friends Isabelle and Audrey Rufin. The girls met 5 months ago. 16-year-old Amélie and 17-year-old Audrey became friends at school after the Rufin sisters moved to Le Portel. Soon they became inseparable, just like their older sisters, 20-year-old Peggy and Isabelle. The girls spent the entire half of the day getting ready. Everything had to be perfect for the carnival evening. Finally, they were ready. Peggy transformed into a marquise, Amélie into Pierrot, Audrey chose a musketeer costume, and Isabelle turned into an Indian. Their older sister Virginia joined Audrey and Isabelle. At 8:30 p.m., the 5 girls left the house to walk to the square where the festival was taking place. Despite the cold and rain that evening, all 5 were in a great mood. The friends sang and danced together with everyone. People in carnival costumes gathered from all sides. Meeting their friends, they briefly stopped at a cafe to warm up. At 11:30 p.m., it was time to go down to the Portel beach to see the highlight of the show, the burning of Batista, a rag doll. This was the highlight that Peggy and Amélie wanted to show Audrey and Isabelle. A huge bonfire had already been prepared on the beach. At midnight, the rag doll burned out, and as tradition requires, all carnival participants head to the village of Équihen, located 3 kilometers to the south. 2 hours before that, the girls agreed to meet their friend Eve halfway and go together. But the young man never saw the girls. He decided that they had changed their minds and went to warm up at Peggy and Amélie's. In reality, there was no reason for Eve to worry since many people gathered at the carnival, and the townspeople in carnival costumes continued to walk back and forth between Portel and Équihen. Morning came. The carnival was over and Peggy's and Amélie's mother came to the main square to pick them up. Marie-Josée Merlin bought croissants to have a snack with her daughters and listen to their stories about the evening, but they didn't show up at the meeting place. The woman returned home around 7:30 a.m., woke up Virginia and asked where the girls were and why they hadn't returned yet. Virginia replied that the carnival ends at 6 to 7 a.m. and they need more time to get back, or they might have stayed overnight at Isabelle and Audrey's. Meanwhile, Isabelle and Audrey's mother was also starting to get nervous. She had let her daughters go to the carnival and worried that they hadn't returned yet, but thought they had stayed overnight at Marie-José's. As time went on, and when the 2 mothers spoke on the phone, it turned out that neither of them had seen the girls. None of their friends or relatives knew where they were. Anxiety was growing. It was not like the girls to disappear like this. They always let their families know if they were going to be late. At 9 o'clock in the evening, driven mad with worry, the parents went to the police station. But to their deep disappointment, the police officers were not at all concerned. The girls were at an age when they could relax and forget about everything, especially during the carnival season. The police officers assumed that there was a carnival in the neighboring town and the girls went there to have fun. In other words, the girls' disappearance amounted to a simple escape. However, the parents knew for sure that they would not have run away in carnival costumes without money and documents. Moreover, they were very attached to their mothers. Marie-Josée Merlin had recently suffered a heart attack and the daughters were afraid to do anything that could upset their mother. Isabelle and Audrey were also attached to their foster mother, Laure. The woman had adopted Audrey, Isabelle, and their older sister Virginia after their mother's death when the girls were 3, 4, and 6 years old. The girls appreciated the love that surrounded them and would not have run away. Convinced that there was no point in running away and faced with the lack of reaction from the police, the relatives organized the search themselves. They began to post flyers around the city, searched the lighthouse, beaches, and abandoned bunkers built during World War II, and even inspected the abandoned tunnel of the city. The family even approached the boats moored at the pier and locked on them, assuming that the girls could be locked inside. In a cafe, they found a souvenir photo of Audrey in a musketeer costume, which confirmed that they were at the carnival. But for the next 48 hours, there was no other news about the girls. Then, thanks to flyers, calls from witnesses began to come to the Lamotte family's home. People confirmed that they had seen the girls in Portel and remembered 4 outfits. But after the crowd headed to Équihen, no one saw them. What is even more disturbing, witnesses reported a white van with white stripes, the passengers of which were staring at the walkers, following them, and generally behaving suspiciously. They also attracted increased attention because on that carnival evening, they were without costumes. This was a very interesting lead, but the police continued to adhere to the version of the escape. Families who were tired of hearing the same excuses decided to alert the press. Fortunately, journalists did not believe the escape version, and on Sunday, February 16th, an article appeared in the local newspaper. The journalist mentioned the van with green stripes. Reporters from all over the country picked up the story. Faced with pressure from the media, the prosecutor finally acknowledged that the escape may not be the only version of what happened. After 6 days of the girls' disappearance, the investigation started from scratch. The police quickly confirmed that a specific van was spotted on the night of the carnival and found witnesses, a family of 2, who reported the car's license plate number. At the same time, another call came into Laura's house. The woman reported that the wanted van was located in a neighboring village. According to the woman, it belonged to 2 scrap metal dealers who were well known in the village for their crimes. The woman added that they needed to hurry because the brothers were already repainting the van. With the license plate number, the police also identified the brothers as Jean-Michel and Jean-Louis Jordan. Could the brothers be the kidnappers of the 4 girls? It turned out that the brothers were long known to law enforcement. They grew up almost uneducated in completely unsuitable conditions for normal life. These people lived separately from society. According to rumors, their mother practiced incestuous relations with her sons, and their father was an aggressive alcoholic. 38-year-old Jean-Louis is the eldest in the family. He suffers from developmental abnormalities, was convicted of harassing girls, and spent 1.5 years behind bars. Barely released from prison, he received 10 years for violence against a girl but was released after 5. His brother Jean-Michel's criminal career is even more impressive. At 15, he attacked a 12-year-old girl so fiercely that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which is rare. After his release from prison, when his wife was preparing to become a mother, he killed his ex-girlfriend, 18-year-old Anita Dassonville. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison but was released after 9. Jean-Michel was married and had 3 children, one of whom, young Jennifer, died of meningitis. His second wife described him as a great husband and caring father, an opinion that was not shared by many. Those around him considered him a bundle of nerves with muscles. If young girls fell into the hands of the brothers, one should beware of the worst. The police had enough of this to interrogate the brothers. On Wednesday, a week after the girls' disappearance, the police carried out a large-scale operation to detain the Jordan brothers. And if they are the ones holding the girls, the slightest mistake could be fatal. Upon arrest, the brothers did not resist, but were surprised by the police's appearance. There were no girls in the house, although what the police saw there horrified them. The house resembled more of a dump, and there was a strong smell of filth. A little boy sat half-naked next to a German shepherd and was eating from a dog bowl. In total, there were 9 people living in the house, including 5 children under the age of 12. The police seized a van. It had been repainted, but what was even worse, the interior had been thoroughly clean. What are the brothers trying to hide? A race against time began for the investigators. They can only detain the brothers for up to 48 hours and need to make them talk, because right now they have suspicions, but absolutely no physical evidence. The brothers insisted in unison that they had not approached the carnival square. However, after the testimony of numerous witnesses was presented to them, they admitted to simply passing by but swore they had not crossed paths with any of the girls. By Friday morning, after the brothers had been in custody for 30 hours, time was running out for the investigators. So they decided to change tactics. The detective knew that the brothers had a younger sister who had disappeared long ago and was likely already dead. Jean-Louis was deeply attached to his sister and had been grieving her loss for a long time. The detective laid out photos of the missing girls and began telling the suspect about each one. He appealed to Jean-Louis' emotions, saying that they had families waiting for them. Although they couldn't save his sister, there was still a chance to help the girls and return them to their families. At these words, Jean-Louis leaned back in his chair, sighed, and declared that the girls were dead and that he was directly involved. He agreed to show where the bodies were buried. Journalists gathered outside the police station watched as the police car raced off in an unknown direction, and they followed. The entire procession stopped at the base of a dew. The police, together with Jean-Louis, went to the spot he had indicated. They had to dig for a very long time, so long that the detectives thought the man had deceived them and that there were no bodies there. Suddenly, a piece of red fabric from one of the musketeer costumes emerged. All 4 girls were lying in a pit measuring 1 by 2 meters. They were wearing carnival costumes that they had worn to the masquerade. On the other side of the dune, impatient journalists saw 4 hearses approaching. They arrived in silence. Then it became clear to them that the hearses were carrying the bodies of the 4 missing friends, and they rushed to report the news to the public. The families of the girls learned of the horrific news from the radio. The missing girls were found, but the nightmare was only beginning. On February 24th, forensic experts conducted an autopsy. They discovered that the perpetrators had chosen strangulation as their method of murder and had sexually assaulted 3 of the victims. Isabelle became the first victim. She was severely beaten and then strangled. She likely put up the most resistance to her kidnappers. Peggy was sexually assaulted and then attempted to be strangled. However, she was buried alive. Sand was found in her esophagus, indicating that she was still breathing when she was buried. Amélie was even more beaten than the previous 2 girls. She was sexually assaulted and then killed. Finally, young Audrey was subjected to every kind of violence one can imagine. When Audrey was the last one alive, the perpetrators likely just played with her. Now the police wanted to know how it all happened. But during questioning, the brothers presented conflicting versions that only began the same way. Around 11 p.m., they met 4 girls dressed as musketeers, an Indian, a Marquise, and Pierrot, and agreed to give them a ride to Équihen. They only had to drive 3 kilometers, and one of the girls quickly noticed that they had been driving too long and in the wrong direction. They yelled that they wanted to get out. One of the girls tried to open the van door, but it was blocked. According to Jean-Louis, Michel ordered him to calm down the captives, while he himself drove the van even faster. They arrived at Saint-Cécile Beach and brought the captives to an abandoned bunker. These are defensive structures that have survived in France since the war. The bunker has only one exit, which makes it an ideal prison for captives. And this is where the brothers' versions diverge. Jean-Louis said that he was guarding the girls in the blockhouse while Jean-Michel took them one by one. When his brother came for the last captive, Jean-Louis followed them to the top of the dune, where 3 girls were lying motionless on the ground. In his presence, Jean-Michel killed the 4th victim, and they buried the bodies together. Jean-Michel, in turn, admits that he led the victims to the blockhouse, but once inside, he left them in the company of his brother and went back for the keys, which he had left in the van. When he returned, his brother showed him 4 bodies lying on the top of the dune. They buried 2 of them. So, each of the brothers denies violence and murder. The most they did was to help bury the bodies. Without being able to rely on the suspects' statements, the detectives waited for evidence to prove the brothers' involvement in the murder. Forensic experts started with examining the van, which was an ideal trap. The lock on the back door was broken so that it could only be opened from the outside, and the van was cleaned out. However, upon closer inspection, investigators found a piece of an earring, a fragment of Audrey's earring that was torn off of her. This was evidence that the girls were brutally beaten inside the van. The problem was that besides the valuable evidence, the police did not find any DNA evidence of the brothers or the girls. They found some suspicious stains, possibly blood, but they were unable to conduct an analysis. Of course, the brothers cleaned it perfectly, but in 1999, the police did not have modern DNA analysis tools. Therefore, there was very little physical evidence to link the Jordan brothers to the crime. The DNA found on the victims' bodies did not allow for the exact identification of the perpetrator. Learning about this, Jean-Michel used this opportunity to retract his previous statements and deny any involvement in the crime. With minimal evidence and conflicting testimonies, the investigation could only rely on the reconstruction of the crime scene. Jean-Michel refused to cooperate, so the words of Jean-Louis were the only ones that could be verified. He showed the path that he, his brother, and the victims took towards the blackthorn bush. More accurately, they didn't walk, but rather crept because they first had to descend to the beach and then move along the boulders. It is important to remember that it rained on the night of the tragedy, and the tide reached almost to the blackthorn bush. Could two brothers lead four girls against their over wet and slippery stones in pitch darkness? But Jean-Louis insists that his brother then escorted each girl to the top of the dune. He describes the order in which his brother led the girls, of course not by name, but by their masquerade costumes. However, in the blackthorn bush, it was pitch dark and the brothers had no flashlight. How could he have seen their costumes? Furthermore, the path he indicates is strewn with even greater obstacles. There is barbed wire on it, on which no piece of fabric was found, although the girls could not have crossed it without tearing their elaborate masquerade costumes. A careful examination of the girls' costumes did not reveal any tears or even snags. After this reconstruction, there were more questions than answers. The main ones being, under what circumstances were the girls killed, and how did the brothers divide the roles between themselves? The psychiatrist who talked to them described them as dangerous predators, especially Jean-Michel. Could either of them have remained hungry? Yet each of them insisted that at most, they helped the other bury the bodies. Now that the investigation is over, the jury will have to decide this dilemma. On October 16, 2002, the trial of the brothers began in St. Amma. During the trial, it became known that a few days before the carnival, the predators were already searching for prey. They almost kidnapped a young woman in Bursurma. She had been in a phone booth for 19 hours, and her friend was calling from another nearby booth. The girl noticed a van with green stripes that pulled up next to the payphone. The driver, whom she identified as Jean-Michel, stared at her intently when Jean-Louis appeared, ready to pull her inside by force. Luckily, her friend approached at that moment. Jean-Louis saw him, closed the door, and the van drove away. This was not the only similar story that the jurors heard, leading them to believe that the brothers had bought the van specifically for the purpose of kidnapping girls. However, Jean-Louis continued to claim that he had done nothing. It was like talking to a wall when trying to talk to his brother. The prosecutor was worried that the jurors would only accuse Jean-Michel, believing he had played a passive role. Jean-Louis, perhaps unintentionally, was playing a winning game. Therefore, the prosecutor requested that all participants in the trial be taken to the scene of the incident. Such a practice is very rare, but in this case, the prosecution considered it necessary to understand how events unfolded that night. On October 25, 2002, all court participants went to the beach of Saint Cecile. As expected, the jurors could not even reach the Blackthorn, and you still need to climb to the top of the dune, overcoming a series of barbed wire. It is impossible to make such a journey at night without the victims tearing their clothes and trying to escape. Obviously, the girls were never in Blackthorn. This explains why, despite multiple signs of violence, there was no sand in their intimate areas. In other words, according to the results of the autopsy, the rape could not have occurred on the beach. The prosecutor is sure the violence and murder took place in the van in the presence of two brothers. They put the girls in the van, promising to take them to the beach. When Isabelle realized that they were not going there, she panicked and tried to open the door, but in vain. Jean-Louis beat her fiercely to calm her down. In turn, Jean-Michel parked the van in a secluded corner of the campsite in the dunes, which is deserted at this time of year. The man turned off the engine and joined the girls and brother in the back of the van. The van was the instrument of the murder of the poor girls. It was there, in those horrific conditions, that they were beaten and killed. Peggy's DNA found under Amélie's fingernails provides additional heartbreaking details of the violence. While the girls were being abused, they held onto each other, seeking strength and support from their sister and friend. And then it's simple. You just need to open the door, walk 20 meters, and you'll find yourself at the top of the dune. What we don't know and will never know is what one did and what two did. The exact circumstances of the tragedy may be unclear, but the guilt of the two brothers is not in doubt, because the crime of one brother is so difficult to separate from the villainy of the other. As they prepared for the crime together and spread terror in the surrounding area together, the brothers were dubbed the Siamese Horror Brothers. On October 27, 2002, the verdict was announced. The brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment with maximum supervision for 22 years for Michel and 20 years for Louis. The slight difference is explained by the simple fact that without Louis' confession, the police would still be looking for the girls. To this day, the pain of the families is still very strong. Every year on February 12th, Marie Merlin and her son Gregory return to the beach of Saint Cecile. It's the place where it all ended for them. Gregory says that today he should be a happy older brother, uncle. Instead, he mourns his sisters, kidnapped from the carnival on a night that was supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives. In February 2003, the blockhouse that became a stumbling block in the case was blown up. The police protected the family from an angry mob, but a few days later, arson destroyed the Jordan family's home. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și în legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
Nu vă numiți.
sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sechestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă cheam Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un punct de reper unde te afli în Caracal, cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old, dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found, and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Mashishano, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Gerga Dinca, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Georga as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Georga's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Georga himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day. He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Georga started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Georga returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Georga say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Georga Dinca was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Georga confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Louisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Louisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Louisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Dinca was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Louisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Louisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Louisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Louisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Louisa's grandfather, assuring him that Louisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Louisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the fourth day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Louisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Louisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Masishanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobrosloveni was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Caracal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Caracal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the two murders came to light, the criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Caracal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Louisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Gheorghe stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Louisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Gheorghe was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Louisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Gheorghe intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the two murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims, As there were likely more than 2 bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Gheorghe began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Luisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louisa's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon. He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Luisa refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Luisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Georga might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Georga, but Alexandra's mother and Louisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Georga might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Georga's car was connected to Louisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Georga's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Georga hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Georga Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Georga had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Georga's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Georga's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Georga most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Georga was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the caracal monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Georga was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Georga once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victim's relatives will never be able to forget what happened. On November 6, 1994, Jan Balmain stands on the platform of Newcastle Railway Station, Australia. She cranes her neck, trying to catch sight of the approaching train. Jan eagerly awaits the arrival of her 22-year-old daughter, Revelle, who boarded the train to Sydney. The journey takes just 2 hours. A mother waits, anticipating her daughter, an extraordinarily beautiful blonde with blue eyes, tall and slender, to flutter onto the platform and embrace her. Revelle Balmain lives in the prestigious Sydney suburb of Bellevue Hill, not far from the city centre. She is a model and a dancer. She had planned to visit her parents before a work trip to Japan, where her troupe awaited her for their 4th tour. But there is much that Jan doesn't know about her daughter, and on this November day, Revelle does not disembark in Newcastle. Traces of her short life are scattered across Sydney's streets, including items intended to accompany her to Japan, a journey she will never make. 22-year-old Revelle Balmain was close to realizing her dream. As a professional dancer, she had already visited Japan on 3 concert tours and eagerly anticipated her 4th trip. She supplemented her income by modeling, appearing in magazine spreads and product advertisements. Just a few days later, a new issue of a popular Australian magazine featuring Revelle on the cover was scheduled for release, an esteemed accomplishment for a model. Additionally, 4 weeks ago, Revelle met a promising 27-year-old director named Piers Fisher-Pollard. Young, beautiful, and talented, Revelle had high expectations for life, and it seemed like her entire life lay ahead of her. Revelle started dancing at the age of 3. She adored music, jazz, and tap dancing. During her teenage years, she spent a year in a theater school in Britain. However, upon returning from her first concert tour, she realized that performing on stage was her true calling. Unfortunately, it didn't pay as well as she'd hoped, so she juggled dancing with modeling jobs. But even that wasn't enough to cover her bills. Therefore, she decided to improve her financial situation by offering her services to an escort agency. Many girls work in this field for a very short time, facing difficulties, and she was one of them. Much later, Revelle's mother would state that her daughter's decision shocked her family. She had grown up in a loving family, always supportive of their children, and if financial troubles arose, she could have turned to them. The woman speculated that the deeply hidden reason for this decision might have been related to an incident when Revelle was 4 years old and found her 1.5-year-old brother Matthew floating in the pool. He couldn't be saved, and it was very difficult for her parents to recover from this. Perhaps Revelle never managed to overcome it. Nevertheless, in November 1994, Revelle's boyfriend, family, and most of her friends had no idea about her side job. Saturday, November 5th, 1994, was supposed to be her last day working in escort services. At some point, her life took a turn, but after 6 weeks of leading a double life, she was returning to her true love and passion, dance. The day before, she had lunch with her friend Kate Brentnall, who described her as happier than she had ever been. She was very excited about her trip to Japan. Revelle had dyed her hair to a softer, more natural blonde. I thought it was symbolic. I thought she had never looked more beautiful. Sadly, that journey would never take place, because the next evening she disappeared under highly suspicious circumstances. Revelle spent Saturday morning with Piers. In the short time they had been dating, they had become inseparable. However, suddenly Piers developed an intense headache, forcing them to go to the hospital. After seeing the doctor, Revelle suggested having lunch, but Piers declined due to his migraine. Around noon, he escorted her to a bus stop. Revelle headed to the city center while Piers preferred to lie down. At that time, Revelle was working for 2 different escort agencies. One of them was managed by Jane Stanojevic and Zoran Stanojevic. As her boyfriend, Piers, couldn't spend time with her, Revelle called Jane and Zoran's escort agency to inform them that she was available. The administrator replied that she had a 2-hour booking from 4 p.m. It was for a new client, a young man named Gavin Samer, who lived in the eastern suburb of Sydney called Kingsford. Later at 10 p.m., she had another appointment with friends of Zoran from Serbia. Zoran was eager to please his friends and suggested having her accompany them to the hotel because he wanted to offer them the most beautiful girl. Revelle arrived at Gavin Samer's house with a bottle of champagne as requested by Gavin. She was wearing cork wedge shoes, a long skirt, and a tunic. She had a pager. During that time, there were no mobile phones, so escort agencies handed pagers to the girls, sending them messages as new orders came in. At 3:50 p.m., Revelle used Gavin's phone to call the administrator and let them know she had arrived. This was a way for the girl to signal that she felt comfortable at the client's house and that everything was fine. 2 hours later at 5:50 p.m., she called the administrator again and said the meeting was over and she was leaving, but there was no need to send a driver for her. However, as Gavin later revealed, she didn't leave, but instead arranged to spend an extra hour with him for additional payment. This was a risky practice because the owners of the escort agencies did not approve and sometimes punished the girls for such side jobs, naturally because they didn't receive their share of the profit. While she was with Gavin, her boyfriend Pierce messaged her, feeling much better. She told him she lay down to rest. Pierce easily believed this as he had no suspicion about her side job. At 7 p.m., she received a message on her pager from her friend Kate Brittle. 15 minutes later, Revelle called back and let her friend know she couldn't talk, but would call from home in an hour after changing, and then they would have a couple of beers together at the Royal Hotel, a popular pub in Sydney. Afterward, she planned to meet Pierce. The sun set that day at 7:25 p.m., according to Gavin. That was the last time he saw Revelle when he dropped her off at the nearest pub, the Tomato Inn. He pulled up to the pub, she got out of the car, said goodbye, and entered through the back door. Gavin then went to a store for cigarettes and cider before heading home, watching TV, and going to bed. At 7:53 p.m., Revelle's boyfriend Pierce sent her another message on her pager, but she didn't reply. By this time, Pierce had met their mutual friend Zoe. They were visiting different bars in the city, and Pierce constantly messaged Revelle on her pager so she'd know where to find them. The last time he attempted to contact her was at 2:30 a.m. Then he went home to sleep. She didn't respond to any of his messages. On the following day, November 6th, Revelle's mother, Jen Belmain, stood on the railway platform in Newcastle, awaiting the arrival of the train from Sydney, on which her daughter was supposed to arrive. Revelle's parents were eagerly anticipating their daughter's arrival to have a sort of farewell celebratory dinner, to catch up, chat, share the latest news before she was due to embark on a 2-week rehearsal in Brisbane, followed by her troupe's upcoming 4-month tour in Japan. The train arrived, but Revelle wasn't on it. Jen assumed that her daughter might have missed the early morning train and waited for the next one. However, Revelle still didn't appear. As time passed, Jen realized that something was amiss. She returned home and immediately made phone calls. She contacted her daughter's friend, the apartment neighbor, and hospitals in Sydney, trying to ascertain her whereabouts. When Revelle's apartment neighbor informed Jen that Revelle's room still had an almost fully packed suitcase with her belongings, passport, and ticket to Japan, Jen realized it was time to involve the police. Jen, along with Revelle's apartment neighbor and her boyfriend Pierce, reported Revelle missing. However, the police were not swift in commencing an investigation, despite the discovery of Revelle's belongings scattered throughout the Kingsford area, where her last client, Gavin Seymour, resided. Her bag, cosmetics, diary, credit cards, and keys to the Bellevue Hill apartment were found strewn across different streets. One of her high heels was found in a trash bin, while the other was discovered in a nearby block. The plastic casing of her pager was lying in a gutter. On the 5th day after the girl's disappearance, when everything indicated an unfortunate event involving Revelle, the police started their investigation. Initially, they explored the version that Revelle was abducted on the streets of Kingsford, with the abductor throwing her belongings out of the car window while driving. Wild rumors circulated, suggesting she might have been abducted at the request of an Arabian prince and taken to Saudi Arabia. However, the police attempted to investigate more realistic scenarios. Pierce was the first to be excluded from the list of suspects. Investigators considered the possibility that he might have learned about the girl's double life and became so furious that he killed Revelle. However, when informed about her side jobs, it was a double blow for the young man. He had an alibi for the evening of her disappearance, and apart from her family, a few friends, and her roommate, he was one of the few people who insisted on continuing the investigation, demanding a more serious approach to the case. Next in line as a suspect was Gavin. Several suspicious moments arose in his story. He recounted that on that Saturday, when he decided to engage the services of the escort agency, his girlfriend Michelle had left home to visit her family. He hired Revelle and paid her $500 for 3 hours. To pay Revelle, he pawned Michelle's clarinet and received $250 for it. Additionally, he won $150 at slot machines in the Tomato Inn pub. This summed up to $400. He paid this in cash and another $100 to Revelle by check. However, the pub staff couldn't recall cashing out his winnings, and he allegedly lost his family's checkbook. Even in the store where he bought cigarettes and cider, there were no records corresponding to the man's claims. His girlfriend Michelle was, of course, questioned. She flew from Brisbane to Sydney 2 days after Revelle's disappearance. Gavin met her at the airport, and she immediately noticed scratches on Gavin's chest and neck. There was also a mark on his finger, as if from a bite. The police also noticed these wounds, but Gavin couldn't explain where they came from, whether from surfing activities or gardening. Michelle also pointed out that Gavin cleaned his car and folded the rear seats, although she added that he often turned the car into a mess, then cleaned it to accommodate his surfboard. Additionally, her incredibly lazy boyfriend laundered the bedding and hung it out to dry just before her arrival. She found it suspicious, but it likely indicated his attempt to hide infidelity rather than criminal activity. Unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence, the police couldn't even conclusively prove that a crime had occurred. The Revelle parents were determined to seek justice for their daughter, but no one was arrested or charged with anything. A member of the Revelle family claimed that the police considered Revelle's life less valuable because she was promiscuous, hence they half-heartedly conducted the investigation. Gavin's house was searched not immediately after the girl's disappearance, and even then, it was done without a warrant. It was more of a cursory inspection. Gavin's car was checked for DNA and other evidence only after 10 days. Many crucial witnesses were not interviewed and evidence was not gathered. Naturally, the investigation stalled, and there were no developments in it for several years. Only in 1999, after an active campaign by the public, media, and the girl's relatives, did interest in the case resurface, and it was reviewed by the coroner. The detective who led the initial investigation told the coroner that, in the police's opinion, Gavin was the prime suspect in the case. Even Gavin's lawyer, Seymour, was forced to agree that his client was the sole suspect. Gavin worked for the girl's parents' company and at the time was an attractive, successful young man. Additionally, he was quite athletic as he loved surfing. Gavin lived with his girlfriend, Michelle, but when she went to visit her family, he decided to hire an escort. Gavin was the last person seen with Revelle. According to him, she spent an additional hour with him before he dropped her off at the Red Tomato Inn, a pub in Kingsford. He parked his car in the back. Revelle exited the car, said goodbye, and walked inside through the back door. He then went to a store and headed home. However, nobody at the pub who was present at that time could recall seeing Revelle. The owner explicitly stated that they had a different crowd that evening, and if such a girl had entered the pub, everyone would have noticed. Despite Gavin purchasing cider at the store, no one remembered this. In other words, after Revelle's last call to her friend from Gavin's house at 7:15 p.m., nothing from Gavin's account was officially confirmed. Moreover, Michelle, now his ex-girlfriend, told the coroner in 1999 that she called Gavin that evening but got no answer. After several attempts, she finally got through at 9:22 p.m. and he sounded agitated. His other ex-girlfriend, who had been involved with him before, stated that after drinking, he could become aggressive and hit her in the face. This raised suspicions further, especially because Gavin had been drinking on Saturday throughout the day and had at least consumed half a bottle of champagne brought by Revelle. However, one witness, a young man named Jeremy Coughlin, offered a completely different scenario of what might have happened to Revelle. Jeremy was a friend of one of Revelle's wealthiest clients, Mark Colton. Jeremy recounted that he and Mark were at a party when, after a few drinks, Mark abruptly said, "Aren't people stupid? Have you heard about Revelle Belmain? First, there were rumors about an Arab prince who took her to Saudi Arabia. Nonsense. She's at a depth of 3 meters and nobody will find her body. That's what you get for deceiving the brothel you work for. The brothel owner wanted her dead because she was damaging his business." Jeremy asked his friend about Mark's relationship with Revelle, and he replied that he met her outside the brothel, paying her between $500 to $1,000 a week, which was cheaper than paying the agency $200 per hour. When Mark Colton was questioned, he denied saying anything like that, but he indeed had heard rumors that agencies were threatening employees who saw clients privately. Owners of the agency were also questioned. It turned out that on Revelle's last day working at the escort agency, she owed Jane and Zoran money, around $300. However, as explained by Jane, this wasn't considered unusual. While most clients pay with credit cards, some prefer cash, and at the end of each week, the girls in the agency reconcile who owes what to whom. According to Jane, Revelle was planning to repay the money owing to a meeting with Zoran's friends scheduled for 10 p.m. However, Zoran claimed he was unaware of such an agreement. In fact,
His words contradicted those of his wife on almost every point. Jane described that on the day the girl disappeared, she and Zoran bought a television, had pizza at a pizzeria around 5 p.m., and went home. She didn't work that night because she was heavily pregnant and tired. However, Zoran told the police he didn't work on the evening of the girl's disappearance, literally saying, "No, not on Saturday." He claimed he took the TV to the office, installed it, and returned home around 7 p.m. Yet, 4 years later, during the coroner's inquest, he stated that by saying, "No, not on Saturday," he meant not during the day on Saturday. In reality, he did work that evening and returned home around 2 a.m. He blamed the misunderstanding on the translator. However, later, a linguistic expert confirmed that the original statements of the man were translated correctly. Regardless, Zoran claimed he did not see Revelle that night. As the agency's driver, he picked up another girl, Kelly, at 7:15 p.m. He took her to meet his friends at Royal Hotel Park in Darling Harbour, where he waited for 2 hours before driving her to another appointment at the Sheraton Airport Hotel. When he was taking the girl home, he had a flat tire, which he had to fix himself. For 4 years following the girl's disappearance and before the case was considered by the coroner, the police did not interview either Zoran's Serbian friends, who had long since left for Belgrade, or Kelly, Revelle's colleague, who provided Zoran's alibi. Partly this was because when Jane Stanojevic gave her initial statement in 1994, she said that Revelle was supposed to meet the Serbians at the Swiss Grand Hotel in Bondi. After 4 years, she claimed she had made a mistake and actually meant the Park Royal Hotel in Darling Harbour. It wasn't until 1999 that the police checked the registration records of both hotels, finding no information about the Serbians in either. Only after Zoran's testimony did the police locate Kelly, who reluctantly corroborated his words. However, when the police checked the Sheraton Hotel records, they couldn't find evidence of Kelly or her client being there. Gavin Seymour, the lawyer, was puzzled as to why the girl was miraculously found only now, why she wasn't questioned 4 years ago, and why the police didn't investigate inconsistencies between Zoran's and his wife's statements, which couldn't even agree on whether he was working on November 5th, 1994. In response to all these questions, the chief investigator who led the initial investigation said that he didn't know. The Revelle family was deeply upset by what they heard during the coroner's inquest. The police failed to interview many crucial witnesses, and other witnesses, of course, had long forgotten what they had seen over such a period of time. Their lawyer stated that the girl's parents were treated as a nuisance, despite their only desire being to know what happened to their daughter. Didn't they deserve that? Even the coroner was forced to agree that the initial investigation wasn't as thorough as it should have been. After examining the case, the coroner dismissed the theory that Revelle staged her own disappearance because there was no evidence to support it. After all, if she wanted to disappear, the timing was extremely inconvenient. She was already planning an extended trip to Japan and would have returned to pursue her career as a model and dancer with renewed vigor, making her short stint as a call girl forgettable. Additionally, her personal life seemed perfect. She and Piers were crazy about each other, and there was nothing indicating that she wanted to run away. On May 28, 1999, the coroner ruled that Revelle was murdered on November 5, 1994, by an unknown person or persons. He noted that there wasn't sufficient evidence against the police's main suspect, Gavin Seymour. However, if his name had been hidden from the public eye until then, now everyone knew who was considered the prime suspect in the case. Before the coroner ruled that Revelle was murdered, the police had no body or evidence to work with. It was only in 2008 that detectives from the cold case unit sent forensic experts to Gavin's house, due to advancements in technology. Subsequently, detectives went to Tasmania to question Gavin, but he refused to provide DNA. Gavin, once a successful young man, moved to Tasmania and worked as a chef due to being essentially accused without trial of Revelle's murder. He led a very secluded life, drank heavily, and hardly interacted with locals. After spending 15 years there, he returned to Sydney in 2018. He only spoke to a journalist once, explaining that the case had cost him job opportunities and felt as though he was punished without being proven guilty. He knew people considered him guilty, but he claimed innocence. In reality, he was more preoccupied with how the case affected him than Revelle and her loved ones. However, he stated he didn't kill Revelle. He was only guilty of hiring a call girl that day. Revelle's parents passed away without receiving answers about their daughter. What happened to her? Who killed her and why? Her sister still hopes the case will progress. Over the years, she searched for her sister's body. Now, she seeks answers. She needs to know who killed Revelle. It seems her prayers were answered because in 2021, a new phase of the investigation began. The police announced a reward of $1 million for information leading to Revelle's killer's arrest. Additionally, Jane King, former owner of the escort agency and Zoran's ex-wife, made an incredible statement. She said she never thought Gavin Seymour could be involved in Revelle's disappearance. However, she now had new evidence supporting Gavin's truth, evidence that would help clear his name but was not found by the police conducting the initial investigation. Essentially, his whereabouts that evening were confirmed. That's all she could disclose at the moment. This new information turned the investigation upside down. In fact, a series of new facts were discovered in the case, crucial enough to be presented to the coroner in February next year. Yes, it took almost 30 years, but the police identified clear contradictions that shifted the entire focus of the investigation. While old evidence still needs testing with new technologies, the new investigation is focused on Jane's ex-husband Zoran and his constantly changing story. He was one of the main drivers for the company, transporting girls to clients. However, there were always discrepancies in the statements he gave to the police. During the initial interrogation, 10 days after Revelle's disappearance, he claimed he wasn't working that night, but was at home with his wife. In 1999, he admitted to being at work, but his new version of events still didn't align because the evidence crucial to his alibi was not found. Revelle was supposed to meet Zoran's Serbian friends at 10 p.m., but for some reason, the police never questioned them. Incredibly, in 2021, an anonymous call was made to an organization called Crime Stoppers regarding this man, in the photo, who could be involved in the crime. This likely refers to Bojan Prevalovic, Zoran's friend and Revelle's last presumed client. While Jane King never met her husband's friend, she now knows that Zoran arranged something for him the day after the girl's disappearance. He bought a ticket from Australia to Thailand. Essentially, the man Revelle was supposed to meet that evening left the country the very next day after her disappearance, and no one bothered to inquire about the reason for such haste or coincidence. In December 2021, a raid was conducted on Zoran's property, revealing cannabis worth $400,000 and exclusive items valued at $150,000. He faced 36 charges and was denied bail. Most importantly, according to the police, the raids were carried out based on information obtained during the new investigation into Revelle Belmain's disappearance and presumed murder. A detective explicitly stated they were investigating Zoran's involvement in the crime. However, if Zoran's behavior appears unusual, no less suspicious are the actions of Jane King herself. On the day Revelle disappeared, she and Zoran had lunch at a pizza place. The next morning, upon learning that Revelle wasn't answering calls or messages, Jane immediately dialed the pizza place's number. A staff member recalls her being in a panic, as if it were crucial for her to secure an alibi. She allegedly said to the staff member, "The police are investigating a murder. Can you confirm that we were at your restaurant?" Jane denies phrasing it this way. She insists she said disappearance. But regardless of whether she said murder or disappearance, why was she in such a hurry to confirm her alibi on the very day Revelle, a grown 22-year-old woman, had disappeared just a few hours ago? Where did this rush come from? Why was she so certain that Revelle simply missed her last evening order, given that such occurrences had been noted before? Jane King herself hadn't even called the police at that point. Likely, nobody had yet contacted the police, and certainly nobody was conducting an investigation. It seems she was certain that she would be asked where she was that day. One can't help but suspect that Jane and Zoran know more than they want to reveal. At the very least, people who definitely knew where Revelle was that evening, apart from her last client, were the escort agency administrator, Jane King, and Zoran Stanovic. The new police investigation leading to the second coroner's inquest, planned for early next year, is in defiance of the apparent difficulties posed by the time elapsed since Revelle Belmain's disappearance. However, it currently promises the greatest hope that this dreadful case will be solved. Today, detectives are closer than ever to capturing her killer. Eliza Levy was young, worked a lot, and loved adventure. She had her whole life ahead of her, but suddenly she was kidnapped by strangers. They took her deep into the forest, tied her to a tree, and threatened to brutally harm her and her family if she didn't obey. Her relatives were beside themselves with worry.
An elite group of police agents got involved. But could Eliza do something herself to escape? Using an unusual tool, she put a risky plan into action. Then, one night in the dark, she noticed some lights. Was this the end of the nightmare? Or would it start again with renewed force? The 24-year-old Eliza Levy can be called a child of two worlds. Her father, James Levy, was an American born and raised on Long Island, just a few miles from New York City, while her mother, Alicia Ortiz, worked as a school teacher in Ecuador. They fell in love when James was a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1980s and soon married. Of their 4 children, 2 received dual citizenship in both the U.S. and Ecuador. James believed that raising their children in the U.S. was best, but he unexpectedly found them drawn to the peaceful, slow-paced life of South America. So the couple built a home in the middle of the Ecuadorian jungle, just across the border from Colombia. Together, they founded the organization Al Tropico to protect the invaluable tropical forest surrounding them. Eliza, the eldest of the two, adored life in the wilderness. Her adventurous spirit kept her constantly on the move, always ready to search for new bird species or explore uncharted territory. When she returned to Ecuador, she enrolled in university, where she studied botany and biology. It was here that she found a serious passion: cycling. She organized weekly races through the streets of Quito and took long trips across the country. Her other passion became Al Tropico, the group founded by her father. She volunteered, guiding school children through the jungle, teaching them to identify hundreds of species of local birds. The dense jungles of Ecuador are home to many plants and birds, but they also provide the perfect hideout for criminals. And the country's northern border is notorious for its security problems. Illegal militarized Colombian organizations smuggle contraband and prohibited substances into Ecuador and often use small villages on the Ecuadorian side as refueling stations. In 2009, the most infamous of these organizations was FARC, Colombia's left-wing extremist guerrilla group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. It was FARC that held politician Ingrid Betancourt hostage in the jungle for 6 years, a story that spread across the world. However, when you grow up in a region, even one as troubled as this, life from the inside often feels completely different. This is why Eliza never felt unsafe in any part of Ecuador. And it was precisely for this reason that she suspected nothing when a man called her, explaining that he was from her hometown and, as an official, wanted to launch a new bird research project in another city near the Colombian border. Eliza agreed to meet him to discuss the details, as long as he sent a driver to pick her up. They settled on that arrangement. On Saturday, October 17, 2009, one of Eliza's brothers dropped her off at the meeting spot with the driver of an Isuzu Trooper. Eliza got into the SUV, but before doing so, she asked her brother to write down the vehicle's license plate number just in case. At first, everything seemed normal. The driver was calm and friendly, but an hour into the drive, he picked up 2 strangers, claiming they needed a ride. In reality, they had other plans. The men pressed the barrel of a gun to Eliza's neck and demanded that she stay quiet. The strangers were driving Eliza to an unknown destination, but her family in Quito had no idea. The last they'd heard was that she was heading to a meeting about tropical birds. When she didn't return to the city as expected and failed to call, they became worried. Even then, they didn't think the worst, assuming instead that a mudslide, a fairly common occurrence in Ecuador, might have delayed her. At the time, Eliza's father, James, was in San Francisco attending an environmental conference. The family didn't want to alarm him, but after 2 days of growing panic, they sent him a message. On Monday, October 19, 2009, 2 days after Eliza's disappearance, her mother, Alicia, received a call from a stranger. He told her not to worry, that Eliza was fine and with them in Colombia. The caller made it clear that Eliza had been kidnapped, but was in no rush to make demands. Eliza's father caught the next flight back to Ecuador. At first, the Levy family hoped to resolve the situation without involving the police. The question they faced wouldn't have crossed the mind of someone from any other country. Was it even worth calling the authorities? In Ecuador, not everyone trusts the police. Even in the case of a serious crime like kidnapping, some Ecuadorians try to solve the problem on their own. But there was another option. Ecuador's police force has an elite unit specifically for dealing with kidnappings known as UNAS. This unit, made up of 100 specially trained agents, is tasked with tracking down kidnappers and helping families through the harrowing ordeal of a loved one being abducted. They assist with negotiations, ransom discussions, and, when possible, organize rescue operations. The Levy family contacted UNACE. It's worth noting that while kidnapping an American in Ecuador is not unheard of, it is usually a less dangerous scenario, where a tourist is held in a taxi for a few hours and forced to withdraw cash from an ATM. This time, however, the situation was far more serious. The most terrifying possibility was if the kidnappers had ties to FARC, the Colombian guerrilla group. In that case, Eliza could be taken deep into the jungle and held for years. Given this, the UNACE specialists advised the family to also contact the U.S. Embassy in Quito. On the morning of Wednesday, October 21st, 4 days after the kidnapping, FBI agents, UNACE officers, and other agents arrived at the Levy home. They promised to try to track down the kidnappers, but they emphasized that the most critical and delicate task in securing Eliza's release would be communication with the criminals. The leader of the kidnappers had left Eliza's mother with a phone number, but who would have the courage to call him? The agents decided that Eliza's father, James Levy, who was known by the Spanish version of his name, Jamie, was capable of handling the delicate task of communicating with the kidnappers. With the agent's guidance, of course. They handed him a sheet with potential phrases the kidnappers might use and how he should respond. After a brief briefing, James made the call to the leader of the kidnapping gang. He had to ask his wife to leave the room to avoid breaking down in front of her. The conversation lasted 4.5 minutes, and the kidnappers didn't allow James to speak with his daughter, claiming she wasn't with them. However, the most important information they gave him was that Eliza had been kidnapped for ransom, and they would later reveal the amount. James held himself together remarkably well during the call, but that evening after the agents left, he locked himself in his office with a bottle of whiskey and broke down in tears. He was overwhelmed with guilt, blaming himself for what had happened. For years, he had worked with various organizations and groups on both sides of the Ecuador-Colombia border, and he had arrogantly believed that his family was safe from harm. At the same time, Eliza was being held in a remote area of Ecuador, less than 200 miles from her family. She had no way of knowing that they were fighting for her release. All she knew was that the past few days had been the most painful, disorienting, and terrifying of her life. After the strangers jumped into the SUV, they pressed a gun to her neck and promised that nothing would happen to her as long as she behaved sensibly. They threw a towel over her head, cuffed her hands, and gagged her. Then they dragged her from the front passenger seat to the back, laying her on the floor. One of the men moved to the front while another stayed in the back to guard her. Eliza didn't even think about resisting. Everything had happened so fast that she hadn't fully realized she had been kidnapped. It felt like a dream, but it was a nightmare she couldn't wake from. They drove off-road for over an hour, bouncing along rough terrain. Then, the vehicle came to a sudden stop. The door opened. She heard someone approach. A man told her to get out and walk with them. Eliza recognized his voice. It was the man who had arranged the meeting about tropical birds. They led her somewhere to what she sensed was an even more dangerous and isolated place. From the moment she fell into the hands of her captors, Eliza resolved to remain calm and alert. She knew that one wrong move could cost her life. When the captors finally removed the blanket from her head, Eliza saw that they were heavily armed, their faces concealed by ski masks. They told her they were part of a paramilitary group and that the threat extended not only to her, but also to her family in Quito. They claimed they had stationed people around her family's home and warned that if she made any foolish moves, her family would suffer. The men asked if she had a GPS chip implanted under her skin, a measure that wealthy individuals in Latin America sometimes take to track their location in case of kidnapping. That's when Eliza realized that the gang believed she came from a wealthy family. She assured them this wasn't the case, but the men were convinced that her American father would pay a large ransom for her. After that, they forced her to record a message on a phone for her parents. She spoke under their direction. "Mom, Dad, I'm okay. Just do what they say and don't talk to the police." She tried to speak calmly, knowing that her mother would be terrified beyond words. The men then took her phone, watch, and tablet from her backpack, but left her with a change of clothes, a book, and something else she wouldn't remember until much later. They chained her to a tree, next to which they had hastily set up an improvised tent. Under the guidance of the agents, Eliza's father, James, negotiated with the kidnappers regarding the ransom. He knew that kidnappings were common in Ecuador,
but he had always believed his family wouldn't be affected, as they didn't have the money to make them targets. However, in a country where being an American often equates to being seen as wealthy, his worst fears were confirmed when the leader of the gang valued Eliza's life at $1 million. Following the agent's instructions, James told the kidnappers that he wouldn't even consider paying a ransom until he was certain his daughter was alive. Although the criminals had forced Eliza to record a message for her parents, they never sent it. So James asked questions only Eliza could answer, such as the names of her grandmother and godfather. When they received the correct responses, the family was finally assured that Eliza was alive. The urgent issue then became how to raise the money. Despite the U.S. Embassy providing every possible support to the family, they were unable to offer the ransom. If the embassy were to pay $1 million for every kidnapped American, it would set a dangerous precedent. Essentially, the family only had their house, and the bank agreed to loan them $80,000 with the home as collateral. In desperation, James called his relatives in New York, and his brother and sister decided to give him all the money they had saved for retirement. James and his wife planned to sell the house afterward to repay their siblings. James informed the kidnapper that the maximum they could gather was $150,000, but the captors insisted the ransom should be closer to $1 million. With each conversation becoming shorter and more tense, the agents knew time was running out. They hurriedly began surveillance on known criminals in the region who could be suspects. Meanwhile, the family had no idea what Eliza had already endured or what lay ahead for her. By this point, she had spent 2 weeks chained to a tree, only able to move as far as the chain would allow. Exhausted and with limited mobility, she fought to stay strong, but it was becoming harder to battle her fears. Nighttime was her only solace, when she imagined she could hear her mother's voice. She found comfort in this imagined whisper, and, though she had never been particularly religious, she began to pray. Of course, Eliza had no idea that U.S. and Ecuadorian agents were hunting her kidnappers, let alone that Colombian specialists had joined the investigation. Colombians have extensive experience dealing with kidnappings, and their assistance proved invaluable. They provided high-tech equipment to track the leader of the gang's mobile phone. Naturally, there was no guarantee that he was in the same location as Eliza, but investigators had other leads to follow. The most useful lead came from Eliza herself when she asked her brother to record the SUV's license plate number. Investigators matched this number with those of vehicles captured by surveillance cameras at toll booths. They identified the vehicle used by the kidnappers, which had passed through several toll booths and was heading towards the Colombian border. During her captivity, Eliza interacted only with the 2 guards who watched over her. The leader of the gang would come and go, staying in a cabin about 50 yards from her tent, and she rarely saw him directly. The 2 guards played the classic roles of good cop and bad cop. The guard Eliza privately referred to as the good guy would bring her rice and beans and assured her that she would be released soon. In contrast, the other guard, the bad guy, threatened to kill her and her family. He also menaced that he might sell her to a larger, more dangerous group. Eliza understood that he meant FARC, an even more brutal gang experienced in holding hostages. While she was terrified, she cried alone, unwilling to show weakness to her captors, especially the one who was threatening her. It took a lot of willpower, but Eliza gradually managed to overcome her fear. She daydreamed about riding her bike, feeling free. Deciding to take action, she tried to gain the favor of the good guy guard. Indeed, he began talking to her more frequently during meals and even brought her yarn and knitting needles. She knitted 4 scarves for him, hoping to learn more about her family in exchange. He told her that her parents were alive and negotiating for her release. However, her hope was quickly dashed when the other guard openly threatened to cut off one of her fingers to increase the pressure on her parents. After 18 days of captivity, Eliza could no longer simply sit and wait for rescue. There were times when the 2 guards would wander far enough from her tent that she was only held back by a chain with a small lock. The knitting needles they had given her were too big to be of any use, but she wondered if she could find something to break the lock. Her desperation sparked creativity. The kidnappers had taken all her gadgets but left her backpack. At the bottom of the bag, she found some bobby pins. Eliza took 2 pins, bent them, and began to pick at the lock, as she had seen in movies. For the next 3 days, whenever the guards were out of sight, she worked on the lock. She tried over and over again until one day it finally clicked open. With incredible willpower, she managed to stay calm. One of the guards seemed ruthless enough to shoot her if she tried to escape, so she climbed nearby trees to get a sense of her surroundings, trying to see if there was any visible path or if the jungle was too impenetrable. Then she would return, sit down, and relock the chain. Eliza was terrified of being caught. With each attempt, she grew bolder. She had resolved to take the risk and escape from her captors. She closed her eyes, praying for guidance from her mother. At that moment, she thought she heard her mother's voice saying, "Don't risk it, don't run, wait 2 days." Eliza decided to heed the advice and wait, though not for long, as she noticed the guards' growing tension. Her time was running out. Eliza had been independent and comfortable in nature since childhood, and now she used those qualities to keep her mind occupied. She spent hours watching the trees, trying to identify the birds by their colors and songs. During the day, she reread the only book she had with her, a Colombian romance novel. But then the night would come again. The chains around her ankles prevented her from sleeping more than an hour or two at a time, and every rustle in the jungle could signal new danger. On the night of Saturday, November 7th, she suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and distinctly heard some sounds and saw the lights of flashlights. In the dim light, Eliza could only make out silhouettes. There were many of them, and they carried military-grade weapons. The silhouettes moved hurriedly. Eliza feared that these were FARC members. She imagined she might spend years with this group in the Colombian jungle. As the lights and shadows approached her tent, one of the men leaned in. He said something, but she couldn't hear him over her cries and pleas not to take her away. He then said that they were police officers, that they knew her father Jamie, and that they had come to rescue her. When Eliza heard her father's name, a wave of joy washed over her. She could only hope this was not a dream. The officers covered her with a bulletproof blanket and stayed with her while they conducted the operation to capture the armed kidnappers. When UNAC officers called the Levy family to inform them of Eliza's rescue, her mother, Alicia, answered the phone. Suddenly, she began to scream and jump for joy. The family describes this as the best moment of their lives, as if they could breathe freely again. They had to wait a few more hours to learn that Eliza was unharmed and safe. NAS officers brought Eliza back to Quito. Although she was eager to reunite with her family, the UNASE officials had other plans. They wanted to highlight the successful operation to rescue the hostage and encourage other families to seek police assistance without fear. To publicly showcase the moment of reunion, they held a brief press conference before introducing Eliza to her parents. After 3 weeks of anxious prayers and waiting, her family finally embraced her. As for the kidnappers, they turned out to be ordinary criminals rather than a militarized group. Eliza's testimony helped to charge the leader of the gang and the guard who had been kind to her, while the second guard managed to escape. Despite spending 3 weeks in a tiny tent, Eliza tried to maintain a positive outlook on her experience, particularly appreciating the beautiful forest that surrounded her. While no one would wish to spend 21 days in the jungle, she found it far better than being confined in a small, dark room. Her positive attitude helped her recover quickly, and she eventually became a source of strength for her family. Remarkably, just 8 weeks after returning home, Eliza embarked on a cycling trip across South America. She traveled 4,000 miles, and the local press covered her journey. She claims that the sense of freedom she experienced while cycling made the trip a healing experience for her. In 2016, a suburban train was moving along its usual route towards Berlin when suddenly one of the passengers felt unwell. Unfortunately, it was not possible to save him, and the 37-year-old man passed away due to heart failure. Despite the sorrowful nature of his death, he died of natural causes. However, his departure from life triggered a chain of events that led to the resolution of a case that had remained a mystery for 23 years. The German town of Bad Belzig, which was simply known as Belzig until 2010, is located 70 kilometers southwest of Berlin. Today, it is home to 11,000 people. Bad Belzig is considered a historic town because it houses the medieval fortress of Eisenhart Castle, Burg Eisenhart, first mentioned in a document from the year 997, issued by Emperor Otto III, which is quite impressive. Apart from the castle, one of the main attractions of the town is the thermal complex called Steintherm, where families and groups of friends often gather on weekends for leisure and relaxation. Overall, Bad Belzig appears to be an excellent town for family living.
Among the families who settled in the town was the family of Andrea Lohagen. Andrea, her sister, as well as their parents Rosemarie and Freddie, lived on the outskirts of the city in a new residential complex. Andrea was born on January 6, 1977, and by 1993 had grown into an attractive 16-year-old girl. Andrea was in the 11th grade and eagerly awaited finishing school. As one of the top students in her class, she felt confident about her future studies at the university. She was a responsible, intelligent, serious, well-read girl, yet sociable and friendly. Everyone who knew her sincerely loved her. On Thursday, October 7, 1993, there were only 2 school days left before the holidays. Naturally, Andrea was looking forward to the upcoming vacation, shopping, parties, and meetings with friends. On that day, her parents decided to spoil their daughter and took her to a large shopping center where they bought Andrea a pair of platform shoes and Levi's jeans she had been eyeing for a while. At 6 o'clock in the evening, when they returned home, Andrea, as usual, turned on the music cassette of her favorite band, Alphaville, and began selecting what to wear with her new items. Of course, she was in high spirits. Indeed, like any teenager, she couldn't wait to show off her new outfit to her friends that same evening. And Andrea knew the ideal place to reach as large an audience as possible for this. After dinner, around 8 o'clock in the evening, Andrea called her friend to arrange a walk, but she was already in Potsdam. Pogo was the name of the local club where teenagers like to gather. As it often happens with clubs in small towns, it was conveniently located equidistant from the homes of local families, and Andrea and her friends were regular visitors. Pogo was a 15-minute walk from her home, and considering the short distance, the girl often walked instead of waiting for the bus. She hadn't learned to drive a car yet. Moreover, in a small town, she felt safe walking alone in the evening, and her parents were not afraid to let her go out alone. Besides, in the evening, the likelihood of not meeting anyone on the way was higher than encountering someone unfriendly. So, on October 7th, as always, Andrea decided to walk, first asking her parents for permission to leave for a few hours. They agreed, asking her to return no later than 10 o'clock. Andrea agreed without argument and left home at 8 o'clock in the evening. That evening, as always when their daughter left home, her parents stayed awake, expecting Andrea. But when the clock struck 10 in the evening, the girl hadn't returned home. At first, the parents thought she was caught up socializing with friends and either forgot about the time or didn't manage to leave the club on time. They waited a little longer, constantly peeking out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of their daughter. An hour passed, then a second, but it grew later, and Rosemarie and Freddie became increasingly worried. What troubled them particularly was that Andrea was one of the best students in her class, which meant she knew she had to go to school the next day. Therefore, it seemed unlikely for her to intentionally stay out late. It was completely out of character for her because she was a very responsible girl who always came home on time and listened to her parents. Complicating matters was the fact that in 1993, teenagers didn't have mobile phones. Andrea couldn't write or call her parents if she was delayed, and they couldn't find out her whereabouts. By 12:30, unable to contain their worry, the parents began calling her friends, hoping that perhaps she stayed the night at one of their places, as they were closer. But of course, that wasn't the case. No one knew where she was. At 1 o'clock in the morning, driven mad by worry, her father Freddie decided to look for her himself. He drove several times along the road she should have taken to the club, went through other, more remote streets, but he couldn't find his daughter. Shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning, he went to the police station and reported his daughter missing. He probably hoped that the police would act immediately because several hours had passed since she was supposed to return home, but he was mistaken. Officers believed it was too early to take any action. Although this was extremely upsetting and disappointing for the girl's parents, those were the rules. The police often receive reports of missing persons, especially when it involves a teenager, and they prefer to wait a day before taking action because teenagers usually return on their own the next morning. On the other hand, how many reports of missing teenagers could the police get in the town of 11,000 people? Besides, Andrea wasn't a problematic teenager. She had no reason to run away, no conflicts at home or with friends. Andrea was a happy girl who had just returned from shopping. The holidays were near, and she was allowed to hang out and enjoy her youth with friends. Her parents were convinced that Andrea wouldn't have run away, but the fact remained. For Rosemarie and Freddie, this must have been a real nightmare. Sitting at home, unable to rest, fearing for their daughter's life, constantly imagining scenarios of what might have happened to her, knowing that nobody was even looking for her. On the following day, January 8th, Andrea's mother, Rosemarie, also attempted to search for her daughter independently. It's understandable that waiting for the police to take action might have been a real torment. She walked through the town center and along the path Andrea was supposed to take. About 100 meters from the Pogo Club, she noticed a wooded area. Interestingly, this plot belonged to the grandfather of Andrea's former boyfriend, a boy a little older than her, from whom she had parted ways just a few weeks before her disappearance. While exploring this area, the girl's mother stumbled upon a hut where she found a mattress and a hand towel lying around. At that moment, surrounded by trees and hearing only the barking of dogs, she suddenly felt very uncomfortable, almost physically sensing that something was amiss. Suspicion crept into her mind that Andrea's former boyfriend might have something to do with her disappearance, and she would continue to believe this for a long time. Convinced that detectives should inspect this area, she reported it to the police, but once again, they did nothing. They explained that they didn't see any reason or concrete evidence to investigate this territory. It was unclear where the evidence could have come from if they hadn't started their work yet. Perhaps they should have looked for clues in the hut. Nevertheless, they clarified to Rosemarie that they didn't have a warrant, meaning they couldn't legally go there. Only a week after the teenager's disappearance did the police finally begin their work. Law enforcement checked hospitals and transportation, leaving Bag-Belzig, the place where Andrea could have departed from. Helicopters flew over the forests of the town for several days, while ground search teams, including dog handlers, scoured the area. Dog handlers searched the route between the girl's home and Pogo and examined the surrounding areas. To precisely establish Andrea's last actions, detectives interviewed all possible witnesses, everyone present at Pogo on that evening. However, it proved quite challenging, as the police had waited for an entire week and teenagers frequented Pogo every day. They were now confused about the specific day and couldn't accurately confirm if they had seen Andrea at the club on October 7th. Fortunately, after speaking with 21-year-old Yvonne Eshkin, a club employee, they were able to confirm that Andrea was there on the 7th. Yvonne remembered seeing Andrea standing outside the club. While she couldn't recall the exact time, it was definitely before 10 p.m. because Pogo closes at 10 p.m., other witnesses remembered seeing Andrea walking along a dark road towards the club. Another witness reported seeing her talking to two boys. The police questioned 13-year-old Robin and 14-year-old David, who confirmed exchanging a few words with Andrea as she was returning from the club, after which she went home while the boys went in the opposite direction. The police began to suspect that Andrea might have taken an isolated narrow path that would have been plunged into complete darkness at that late hour. The locals referred to this path as the Lover's Path, located between the homes of two families, which would have allowed the girl to reach home much faster than the main road. However, the police could never confirm whether she indeed took the Lover's Path because neither the canine units nor the forensic experts found any evidence supporting this theory. Nonetheless, this secret path was often used by teenagers returning from the club. To attract more attention to the case, Andrea's photo was shown on television, and a reward of 10,000 marks was offered for information that could help find her. The police asked anyone who could assist them in bringing the girl back home safely to contact them. They received over 250 reports stating that Andrea Lohagen had been seen in various countries around the world: Turkey, Greece, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Spain. However, despite the police's efforts to investigate each lead, none of them led to any breakthroughs. Eventually, the police admitted defeat as they had nothing to work with, and the investigation came to a standstill. The case remained unsolved, and Andrea Lohagen was no longer sought after by anyone other than her family. 7 years later, on July 9, 2000, a local resident was enjoying her morning coffee on a beautiful day when she saw Josie, her landlord's dog, joyfully playing with something resembling a soccer ball. However, upon closer inspection, the woman realized that it wasn't a ball but a human skull. She hurriedly called the police. Soon, Frank Friedrich, the woman's landlord, arrived. Unexpectedly, he claimed that he had already seen the skull, took it from the dog, and hid it before leaving to celebrate his parents' birthday. Upon returning home to address the matter, the police were already there. The man explained his peculiar behavior by stating that he knew that during World War II, prisoners of war were held in that area, so he assumed the skull was quite old. Therefore, he hid it, intending to deal with it later.
When the police inspected the area where the skull, presumably that of Andrea, was found by the dog, it turned out to be the very same location warned about by Andrea's mother, just 10 meters behind the lover's path and 100 meters from Pogo. Inside a long-abandoned cabin, behind a weathered door simply leaning against the wall, the police found the rest of the skeleton. Thus, if the killer attempted to hide the body, they hadn't put in much effort. Surprisingly, despite the police searching this location with sniffer dogs in 1993, nobody noticed or smelled anything. Journalists, reporters, the landlord's dogs, construction workers, and local residents had visited the site, all departing with the same outcome. Naturally, the locals, convinced the remains belonged to Andrea, were furious at how the police handled the investigation. The police defended their actions, stating they had investigated the area only a week after the girl's disappearance. Supposedly, they had acted very promptly since the police are obligated to search for a missing person, only if there are suspicions of a crime or several weeks after the disappearance. Regardless, the remains were sent to a laboratory, confirming they indeed belonged to Andrea. DNA comparison was unnecessary as the victim's dental records matched the teeth in the skull. Although the girl's remains were found, the forensic expert couldn't determine how she was killed or what happened before her death, as only the skeleton remained. However, he noted a head injury on the skull. Notably, Andrea was found not where the murder occurred. Her clothing wasn't found in the cabin. Even her watch and favorite ring were missing. To this day, it remains unknown whether this implies the victim was assaulted, causing her clothes to be removed, or if they were taken to conceal evidence.
If the latter is true, the perpetrator's actions seem senseless because the body wasn't even hidden. With the discovery of the remains, the case was reopened, but it was now a murder investigation for Andrea Lohagen. At this point, both the police and the townspeople questioned what the motive for the murder could have been. They were especially troubled by the fact that the lover's path, near where the body was found, was only known to a limited number of locals, suggesting the killer lived in Bad Belzig and possibly was still among them. However, despite this breakthrough and a reward of 5,000 euros for any information, the police still lacked substantial leads, leaving the case unsolved for many years. Everything changed in the summer of 2016 when an unknown woman called the police, claiming she precisely knew who killed Andrea Lohagen, her friend, 37-year-old David. He was one of the two boys who had met Andrea on her way from Pogo. At the time of Andrea's disappearance, David was 14 years old. As an adult, David was a loner who enjoyed solitude, struggled to hold a job due to alcohol and substance abuse issues, and this lifestyle undoubtedly led to health problems. The woman who called the police explained that the reason she decided to share this information was that David had died in the same year, 2016. He was on a train to Berlin when he suddenly fell ill and passed away due to natural causes. It is unknown how long this woman had been holding on to this information. David left no other confessions. The only evidence hinting at his guilty conscience was a dark post on a social media platform. In the photo, a man wearing a shirt with the inscription "Wanted" is seen holding a small child. Underneath the image, he wrote, "You can do the right thing 1,000 times, but make one mistake, and you're worthless." The police tried to learn from David's mother what she knew about the matter, perhaps if her son had confessed to her about the crime. However, she was reluctant to speak with the officers. After all, she still lived in the same town where Andrea went missing, and where her family resided. Eventually, she admitted that her son had told her they and a friend had planned to rob Andrea, but everything went wrong, and Andrea was killed. That was all she knew. The woman who called the police added that at the time of David's murder, he wasn't alone. He was with his then 13-year-old friend, Robin. In 2016, 36-year-old Robin lived in Tyrol, Austria, with his wife and 2 children, worked on a dairy farm, was very quiet, friendly, and spent evenings at home. He was so secretive that his colleagues only learned about his wedding after he decided to change his surname following the marriage. Robin was questioned on October 27, 2016, but since he was 13 years old at the time of the crime, he was questioned only as a witness, not a suspect. Law enforcement couldn't imprison him, even if he confessed to the crime, as he was below the age of criminal responsibility at 13.
Of course, this doesn't seem right. If you understand how to take someone's life, you should be punished in some way. During the conversation, Robin didn't deny David's involvement in the crime, but asked for the opportunity to discuss his own participation after speaking with his family. He was allowed to go home and was given a new date to return to the station for further questioning. However,
Police soon realized that Robin's desire to talk to his family wasn't the real reason for refusing to speak with them. It was merely an excuse to leave the station. Indeed, just a few hours after returning home, he left again. But before that, he left a farewell note for his wife. He put on hiking boots, got into the car, and headed towards Pendling Mountain, located approximately 15 kilometers from his home. There, he climbed the mountain and jumped from it. 4 days later, on November 4th, his body was found by a hunter. In the note to his wife, he didn't explain anything, just bid farewell. The police chief later mentioned that when the detectives spoke with Robin, they explained to him that he wouldn't face any problems, no prison sentence. They just wanted to know why he did it. They wanted Andrea's parents to get answers to the questions that had tormented them for so many years. But Robin decided otherwise. It was undoubtedly difficult for Andrea's parents to come to terms with his departure. With his departure, their last chance to find out the motive behind the murder disappeared. What happened just before Andrea's death and how exactly she died. Why they removed her clothes and how long the girl remained alive. Also, where exactly everything happened. However, it's very interesting that the plot where the cabin was located belonged not only to Andrea's former boyfriend, but also to one of the boys' grandfathers. This is because Andrea's ex-boyfriend and Robin were cousins. David and Robin were troublesome teenagers well known throughout the town. They were often seen smoking or drinking alcohol. Soon they embarked on a series of burglaries, after which they served time in juvenile detention. So, it couldn't be said that they were kids whom no one could suspect of anything. But murder is something much more significant than breaking into someone's house and stealing valuable items. Detectives spoke with the boys soon after they, as later revealed, killed Andrea. At that time, they were not suspected of anything. They were just witnesses. But one can't help but wonder, if you're 13 or 14 years old and you've just committed murder, how composed will you be when the police come questioning you? The detective who interacted with them in 1993 recalls that they were calm and rational. However, they asked various strange questions, like what it's like to be in juvenile detention as a murderer. Additionally, when the detective went to one of the boys' homes, he saw a cassette with inappropriate films on the table. Moreover, when he asked each of the boys to clarify where they met Andrea and which road they took afterward, their statements differed. Nevertheless, the oddities in the boys' behavior and the discrepancies in their statements were not sufficient to accuse them of anything. Certainly, there are many cases where investigators did not hesitate to pressure teenagers and interrogate them for hours on end in pursuit of a confession, but not in this case. Perhaps the police didn't want to interrogate and pressure David and Robin for long, considering their age. Although the police officially closed the case, Andrea's parents are not convinced. They suspect that a third person was involved in the murder. Freddie, the girl's father, couldn't believe that two young boys committed such a heinous crime without the help, guidance, or at least the influence of an adult or someone older than them. Rosemary and Freddie are convinced that they had assistance. Andrea's mother's intuition has proven right before. What if her intuition isn't wrong this time? It was a completely senseless and cruel murder, and even before the killer's death, they did not alleviate the suffering of the victim's parents. Shortly before Andrea's death, she wrote an essay titled The Tale of Happiness. Andrea narrated an encounter with an old man who told her, "I worry about you because you seem so sad." He promised to grant her 3 wishes. The first was a journey at 16, and the second was a happy future. Andrea, being prudent, didn't want to waste the third wish, explaining, "Who knows what will come after, as I am already happy." However pitiful an existence the killers might lead, even if they remembered the crime they committed every day, they could move on. But for Andrea, who loved life so much, hers was taken away. Toledo, Ohio, January 27, 1992. At midnight, a call came in to the local taxi company reporting that 3 unidentified individuals had attacked a taxi driver in the parking lot of the University of Toledo student housing. The caller also mentioned hearing gunshots. The call was redirected to the 911 rescue service, and from there to the University of Toledo officers. 2 colleagues, Joseph Green and Jeffrey Hodge, immediately headed to the specified location. It was quiet and peaceful there, the ground covered in snow, with no signs of the crime that had occurred. Neither the taxi, nor the driver, nor the assailants were noticeable. Nevertheless,
The two colleagues decided to look around, to walk around the entire parking area. Lighting their way with flashlights, the two officers turned the corner of the building and saw the body. It was a girl, lying face down in the snow. The unusual position of her body stood out. Her hands were placed neatly at her sides, palms up. People don't usually fall like that. The victim was without a coat. Her dark blue sweater pulled up, and her jeans and underwear pulled down, fully exposing the midsection of her body. And in those areas of exposed skin, bullet holes were visible. There was also a bullet wound on the back of her head. The most obvious assumption, considering the appearance of the girl's clothing, was that she had been attacked with the intent of sexual violence. The victim didn't have any documents with her, but on the same evening, her roommate reported her disappearance. The victim's name was Melissa Ann Herstrom. Melissa was a 19-year-old student at the University of Toledo, studying to become a nurse. Melissa stood out among other students. She was very beautiful, cheerful, with dark wavy hair and distinctive bright lipstick that emphasized her vivacity and zest for life. Melissa had no enemies, especially not ones who would wish her harm. She wanted to have children and believed she would be a wonderful mother. No one doubted this, knowing what a sincere and kind person she was. She had so much to offer to the world, but she was prevented from doing so in the most callous way. Meanwhile, detectives from the Toledo City Homicide Department were investigating the crime scene. Shell casings were scattered everywhere, and some bullets had passed through the victim's body and into the frozen ground, so the detectives decided to dig them up along with the soil. Interestingly, one of the casings appeared as if it had been split in half by something. Additionally, not far from the crime scene, officers found a set of keys in a trash bin, and notably, among them were keys to a Ford Taurus. Police discovered the Ford approximately a kilometer from the girl's murder site, in a parking lot. What was intriguing was that the crime scene, the trash bin where the keys were found, and the parking lot were 3 different points on the campus map, and the detectives had to connect these points into a cohesive whole. The coroner took Melissa's body to conduct an autopsy. The examination revealed that Melissa had been shot 14 times at close range with a 9mm handgun. She was shot in the back of the head, causing her to fall to the ground, with her hands likely tied behind her back. Then, the killer fired another 13 bullets, shooting her in the back and descending to her legs. It was an incredibly brutal murder, as such a number of bullets was completely excessive. The pathologist ruled out the possibility of sexual assault. There was not the slightest sign of violence. However, she was partly undressed. This means the killer either aimed to humiliate her or wanted to see the damage caused by bullets hitting her exposed body. There was no alcohol or drugs in her system. She was completely sober. Marks on her wrists indicated that at some point she was immobilized with something, resembling handcuff marks. The detectives had no choice but to ask themselves who would use handcuffs. Primarily, representatives of law enforcement or someone pretending to be a policeman. It wouldn't be the first time a killer, pretending to be a policeman, stopped a victim's car and committed a crime. Handcuffs are a means of control, so their suspect is someone seeking complete control over their victims. The news of the murder of the student quickly spread throughout the university campus. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that shortly before the murder, an unknown individual began terrorizing one of the female dormitories. Someone opened fire in the building, firing 9 shots, which were later removed from the walls. Considering that these incidents occurred practically one after another, everyone assumed that they were connected, because such things had never happened before at the University of Toledo. Indeed, it was the first murder on campus in decades, and the students were horrified. Melissa's friends couldn't understand how this could happen, why, and who could have done it. Everyone loved her. It didn't make sense. There were 30 girls living in that dormitory, and they no longer felt safe. Someone called their parents, and they took them home. Melissa's friends were worried that they were in danger, but investigators believed that Melissa was the target because of the brutality of the crime, the 14 shots. When the killer kept shooting at a dead girl, it looked like a crime that could only happen in a fit of incredible rage. Detectives interviewed Melissa's friends about how she spent the evening of January 26th. It turned out that she met up with a friend from the university's women's club, sorority, after which she planned to return home. However, someone called her and informed her that her boyfriend, JR, was spending time with another girl. So Melissa went to the parking lot adjacent to where JR lived. From there, she would be able to see when he returned home and with whom. It was for this reason that the police's initial suspicion fell on her boyfriend. Jealousy and anger often become the motives behind many thoughtless acts, especially since the 14 bullets fired into the immobilized girl indicated the rage of the attacker. Melissa's boyfriend, JR, stated that he was indeed with another girl at his home that evening. He didn't see Melissa and had no idea that someone had informed her of his infidelity. However, things were not as simple as they seemed. investigators found out that Melissa's personal life was more complicated than it appeared at first glance because she was hiding her new relationship from her ex-boyfriend, Kenny. Kenny was a very volatile person, the kind who gets into fights in bars, can punch a wall in anger, and yell threats in fits of rage. Naturally, the question arose of what Kenny would do if he found out about Melissa's new relationship. Thus, the police suddenly had two suspects, the unfaithful boyfriend and the aggressive ex-boyfriend. Both were invited for questioning. They answered questions candidly, sincerely wanting to help the investigation, passed polygraph tests, and had alibis, meaning neither of them had any connection to the crime. However, now that both guys had been ruled out as suspects and no new ones emerged, panic began to spread throughout the university campus. Everyone understood that it still could be a random murder, and fear gripped the University of Toledo. A pair of girls from the women's dormitory reported receiving strange, threatening calls. It was the same dormitory where the unknown assailant had fired shots. The girls were so terrified that university officers escorted them to and from their classes. Since no one suspected who the killer was or why he targeted Melissa, everyone wondered who would be next, fearing that the killer could emerge from around any corner at any moment. Despite this, everyone had to continue studying and working. The detectives, contemplating their next move, noticed similarities between Melissa's murder and recent victims of a serial killer. In Los Angeles, the killer, dubbed the Mountain Strangler by the police, had murdered 10 young women and left their bodies in the mountains along the highway. Sometimes serial killers pose as police officers because it's so easy to set up a flashing light for a car, stop the victim, abduct, and kill. However, this version seemed too far-fetched. Therefore, with no suspects and feeling the tension from the growing panic on campus, the investigators returned to square one. More precisely, it was the call to the taxi dispatch when the caller reported that robbers had attacked a taxi driver. Detectives investigating Melissa's case decided to trace the call and found out that it came from a campus service building, which was locked on weekends, meaning the caller must have had keys. What did this reveal to the investigators? It indicated that the killer had keys to the locked facility. Meanwhile, the victim's hands were likely bound with handcuffs, typically positioned behind the back as police are taught. Reluctantly, the investigators had to admit the obvious. It wasn't a serial killer posing as a police officer, but an actual police officer. Detectives decided to speak with Joseph Green and Jeffrey Hodge again, the two officers from the University of Toledo who found the body. Perhaps they had overlooked some evidence. In fact, both officers had very positive reputations. Joseph was a friendly young man who told silly jokes and was just a pleasant guy. Jeffrey Hodge was also a quiet, modest man who had recently gotten married. He loved his job, was a bit of a Boy Scout, always eager to help, and had previously worked as a 911 dispatcher. He was very eager to contribute to the investigation. Detectives decided to start by questioning Joseph Green because he was the one who found the body and wrote the report. On that day, around 7 o'clock in the evening, it was snowing heavily. The girl had left her friend's place before the snowfall, meaning when Melissa and her killer appeared at the crime scene, there was already snow, and there should have been footprints in the snow. However, according to Joseph Green's report, there were no shoe prints on the ground, only freshly fallen snow. This obvious discrepancy with the facts puzzled the detectives because it was unclear why the police officers went to inspect the area at all if the snow was untouched and there were no footprints leading there. Moreover, they were the ones who found Melissa's keys in the trash bin. What prompted them to look into the trash bin? There was something else that puzzled the investigators. Joseph said, "When I saw the body, I knew she was dead." The investigator was surprised and asked how that was possible. Joseph replied that his family owned a funeral business and he had seen many dead bodies. While these weren't incriminating pieces of evidence, the combined facts urged the investigators to dig deeper. Forensic investigators examined both officers' cars who were on duty that night. They were looking for physical evidence that could tie Melissa to one of the patrol cars. They couldn't find any fingerprints, but they discovered a green wool thread that matched the girl's coat. Additionally, they found a long hair on the seat. At that time, they couldn't conduct DNA comparison on the hair, but it matched the color of the victim's hair. These were more indirect pieces of evidence, but still significant. Officer Joseph wrote a report in which inconsistencies were noted. Now, with the evidence found, the hair and thread in the patrol car, the evidence against Officer Joseph Green began to accumulate one after another like a snowball. He became the main suspect in the investigation. Detectives kept an eye on him, showing up at his house in the middle of the night to collect discarded trash, trying to find something that could link him to the crime. Ultimately, detectives decided to polygraph all officers involved in the case. Joseph Green was the first to be tested, but his test came out clean. Therefore, they had to leave him alone. The only thing that continued to bother the police was his certainty about the absence of shoe prints. Usually, when a police officer sees someone in distress, they rush to them immediately, and that's probably what Green did. So he probably wasn't certain, but insisted on the absence of shoe prints, making detectives suspect him. With Joseph Green, his partner Jeffrey Hodge arrived. Nobody suspected him, but it was decided to polygraph everyone just in case. Before Melissa's body was found, and before Jeffrey started his night shift, he watched the Super Bowl with friends, including other officers. Jeffrey, for some reason, seemed nervous, asking about ballistics, how long a body can remain under certain conditions before decomposition, what it's like to see a body, essentially asking quite strange questions. He also turned on the homeowner's radio on the police frequency. Of course, friends asked him what he was doing, to which he replied that he just wants to know what's going on before going to work. Now, at the station, waiting for the results of his partner's check, he opened up to one of the detectives and mentioned how funny it was to watch the girls from the women's dormitory running out into the street in light, translucent clothing when the fire alarm went off. Such conversations were not illegal, but clearly inappropriate and unbecoming for a married officer tasked with protecting these girls, especially considering it was the same dormitory where the girls were suffering from strange calls and gunshots. Nevertheless, Jeffrey went to the polygraph examiner next. As part of the preparation, he was asked various questions, such as what he considered the best thing that happened in his life, to which he answered, working as a police officer. Jeffrey had worked as an operator for the rescue service and had tried to get into various police departments until he was finally hired by the university. And for his graduation, his grandfather gave him a pistol. The polygraph examiner casually asked which one, and he replied, Smith & Wesson, the same type of pistol from which the fatal bullets could have been fired. The polygraph examiner tensed up but didn't show it, remembering that Jeffrey Hodgson had been at the crime scene and knew how the victim was dressed, the position of the body, and the shell casings found. The polygraph examiner had to work somewhat unusually and formulate a variety of similar questions. For example, was the victim bound with a belt, stockings, wire, tape, handcuffs? And here the polygraph showed how Jeffrey Hodgson clearly reacted to handcuffs. That was enough to cast doubt on him. The detectives asked him to show the pistol given to him by his grandfather. The man agreed and said it was in the locker at the university. But there was no weapon there, and Jeffrey claimed that someone wanted to set him up, which was strange. If someone really wanted to set him up, the gun would have been there. Instead, Jeffrey's handcuffs were confiscated. They were taken to the laboratory and examined under a microscope. Traces of copper and lead, metals associated with bullets, were found on them. Considering that one bullet had fragmented upon impact with something hard, these could well have been the handcuffs. And on their inner rim, specialists found a tiny fragment of skin. However, extracting DNA from such a tiny fragment was not easy at that time and required time. Jeffrey was arrested on February 1st, 1992, 6 days after Melissa's murder. After his arrest, it suddenly became clear that he didn't seem like a nice guy to everyone around him. Girls recounted how he would stop them on fabricated pretexts, claiming they were drunk. Ann Collins was stopped by Jeffrey almost a day before Melissa's murder. She parked her car in an almost empty parking lot, and he pulled up behind her, blocking her. She hadn't been drinking, so she didn't understand why he was asking her about it. Fortunately, the persistence of the young officer seemed strange to her, and she talked to him without getting out of the car, just opening the window slightly. Anne feared and imagined what could have happened if her boyfriend hadn't shown up, with whom they were supposed to have breakfast together. She's sure she would have been Jeffrey Hodgson's first victim. But when her boyfriend appeared, Jeffrey quickly got back into his car and just drove away. Unfortunately, the next evening, he stopped another girl, Melissa Hurstrom, without any reason. The students were horrified when they learned the name of the arrested man. After all, Jeffrey had escorted them to classes when they were scared, told them he was working on the case, and everything would be fine. In other words, he presented himself as a knight in shining armor, although they were actually afraid of him. The case against Hodgson was built on circumstantial evidence until 3 weeks after his arrest, when the DNA test results came in. The fragment of skin on his handcuffs belonged to Melissa Hurstrom. In 1993, 18 months after the murder, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to the murder in exchange for a life sentence with the possibility of parole. He limited his admission to just that and claimed he didn't remember anything about the crime itself. It's unlikely that this is true. He probably remembers every little detail. But even without his confession, detectives had a version of what happened to Melissa that evening. Jeffrey Hodgson patrolled the area of the college campus. It wasn't his first time stopping pretty girls. Unfortunately, Melissa was alone on the street that evening. She wasn't drunk, but she was alone. She didn't have her driver's license with her, and instead of a warning or a fine, Jeffrey Hodson forced her to get into his car and drove her to the dormitory, where she got her license. He convinced her to take off her coat and put it on the back seat of the car so he could get a better look at her body. He was supposed to take her back to her car, but during the ride, he began to harass her. Melissa didn't like it, and she probably told him that such behavior would cost him his job. Another person might have ignored this, but not Jeffrey Hodson. A man who considered being a policeman the best thing that ever happened in his life didn't see himself in any other role. He drove the girl to a remote parking lot, pulled Melissa out of the car, frightened her, handcuffed her, and led her around the corner of the building. This is where he pulled down her clothes, humiliating her, and reached a point where he was horrified by what he had done and saw the only way out for himself in murder. And he shot the girl in the back of the head. Later, he called the dispatcher so he and his partner could answer the call and find the body. After all, he knew for sure that he had left footprints in the snow and needed an explanation of how they got there. He manipulated his partner, allowing him to find the body and write the report. Jeffrey Hodson also confessed to making threatening calls and shooting at the dormitory. He did this to once again respond to the call himself and appear a hero in the eyes of others. His cruelty quickly escalated, and it all ended with him killing a person. The former police captain, who headed the homicide department in 1992, said, in his opinion, Jeff Hodson is a psychopath. It showed in how his crimes escalated. He believes if they hadn't caught him, he would have become a serial killer. He would have struck again. When he was formally dismissed in March 1992, representatives of the university found that he often stopped students, or rather female students, without informing the dispatcher. Once he called a girl's home several hours after arresting her for drunk driving, fabricated reports of robbery and an armed man on campus, as well as violated rules by waiting for students in bars outside the campus and following them to the student village, where he stopped them on suspicion of driving while intoxicated. It is believed that he made a call about a planned bombing against the university president and started fires, committing crimes that he himself investigated. He was not charged with other offenses investigated by the University of Toledo police. The prosecutor offered him a deal because the main evidence against him was DNA. They didn't even find his personal gun, from which he fired at the dormitory and at Melissa. But if today all jurors know what DNA is, and that it's practically a 100% guarantee that the accused is the real killer, in those years, DNA was new, just like a smeared fingerprint. The prosecutor was afraid that Jeffrey would be acquitted. At that time in Ohio, there was also no life sentence without the possibility of parole, as there is today. Therefore, he was sentenced to a term of 33 years to life, but considering the time he had already served in prison and his exemplary behavior, his first parole hearing was held on September 21st, 2021. Melissa's family, her friends, and other people associated with the case, including Anna Collin, wrote letters to the parole board objecting to his release. About 400 letters were sent in total. When Jeffrey killed Melissa, he was only 22 years old. He was still relatively young and could commit more crimes if released. Furthermore, over the years, he never once contacted Melissa's family, never apologized, never attempted to explain what happened that night. Of course, his release was denied, and the next hearing will take place in 2031. The victim's family sued the university because the university administration hired Jeffrey and overlooked the numerous offenses he committed. The university paid the family $1 million, but it didn't make things easier for them. They never heard from Jeffrey Hodson what Melissa did to deserve such a fate. Although more than 30 years have passed, Melissa's university friends have not forgotten about her. A few years ago, they raised funds to create a cozy relaxation area at the university, where students can sit, relax, and remember Melissa, who once also studied at the University of Toledo, dreaming of becoming a nurse. But this was not allowed for her by a 22-year-old policeman with too high an opinion of himself, dreaming of becoming a hero, and instead of that, killing a girl whom he pledged to protect. On a beautiful autumn morning on October 22, 1993, Doug Boggs entered his hardware store in the resort town of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. The store had been in operation for 63 years, a family business that Doug ran with his brother, Gerald or Jerry Boggs. However, that morning, Jerry did not show up for work. This was entirely uncharacteristic of him. Jerry was a creature of habit and adhered to a strict daily routine. Doug became so worried that he went to his brother's home. The front door was locked, so Doug went around to the back door leading into the kitchen. As soon as he opened the door, he saw his brother. Jerry was lying on the floor with blood pooled around his head. It was a horrifying scene that shocked Doug to the core. He immediately called emergency services. The police officers who arrived at the scene based on the man's wounds speculated that he had been beaten with a heavy object and had also sustained 3 gunshot wounds. Now, the investigators had to determine how such a tragedy could happen to one of the most respected and beloved citizens of Steamboat Springs. 52-year-old Jerry Bogs had lived in Steamboat Springs for most of his life. He had only left the town for his studies at the University of Colorado and during his time in the Vietnam War. After returning from Vietnam, he resumed working in the family business, and now he and his brother managed the store together. Jerry handled the paperwork and supply orders while Doug interacted with the customers. Jerry was a fairly strong-willed person, but he was also kind, modest, and a loyal friend. By the age of 52, he had grown accustomed to his established bachelor lifestyle. However, everything changed one fine day when a charming 48-year-old woman walked into his store. She introduced herself as Jill Coit. Jill stood out from the other women in town, even from the tourists. She dressed stylishly and somewhat provocatively, but never vulgarly. She was sociable, cheerful, and spoke with a delightful southern accent. Jill mentioned that she had moved from Culver, Indiana, having bought a small hotel in Steamboat Springs. Since she was fixing up the hotel with her sons, she often appeared in Jerry's store for supplies. Soon, Jerry gathered the courage to make the first move. He asked her out on a date. From that moment on, their romantic relationship began. Just 7 months after meeting, Jerry and Jill got married. This was an unusually spontaneous decision for Jerry, but he had a reason. His beloved was expecting a baby. Jerry had a successful business, family, friends, money, and now his beloved wife was going to give him a child. Jerry was over the moon with happiness. He took the news with full responsibility. He remodeled the house for the baby, bought children's furniture, and read books on parenting. However, his happiness came to an abrupt end as secrets about his wife began to surface one after another. Months went by, yet there were no physical changes in Jill's appearance. By this time, her pregnancy should have been quite visible. Suddenly, Jill went to Texas, and when she returned, she claimed to have given birth to a baby girl named Laura. By then, Jerry's family and friends were not merely suspicious. They outright declared that it was some kind of scam and that he should stay away from her and get a divorce, especially since she forgot to inform him that she was already married at the time they got married. Jerry was devastated, confused as to why she would do this to him, but he knew for certain that the marriage needed to be annulled, as his nature abhorred living in an illegal union. There was also an intriguing financial situation. Jill had convinced Jerry to sign a document stating that he had supposedly lent her $100,000. In reality, he had not given her the money. She needed it to appear as though she owed him a large sum, so she wouldn't have to repay debts to creditors or share finances with her ex-husband. However, after their marriage was annulled and she moved out of his house, Jill sued him. She wanted to remove his name from the document and sell the hotel, which was worth $600,000. As Doug recounted, his brother was already angry about Jill's lies regarding her previous marriage and the fake pregnancy, and the lawsuit brought his indignation and resentment to a new level. Jerry filed a countersuit. He wanted her to stop tarnishing his name, admit there was no pregnancy, and compensate him for his losses. For 2 years, Jerry awaited the court date while he returned to his usual routine. But 6 days before the scheduled court date, his brother found him dead on the kitchen floor. The police carefully examined the crime scene, only to be met with enormous disappointment. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing had been stolen, and the killer had left no clues behind. The murderer took the firearm with them and left no fingerprints or blood on the shovel used to beat the victim. Whoever committed this heinous crime had covered their tracks exceptionally well. Neighbors did not hear any gunshots. However, one neighbor did recall something suspicious. On the day of the murder, she was outside and saw 2 people walking down the street. They looked suspicious enough that she went back inside. Despite the warm weather, they were dressed very warmly and resembled hunters. One was clearly a man, but she wasn't sure about the second person. There was definitely something off about them. At the same time, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy. He determined that the attack on Jerry Bogs had occurred in the afternoon of October 21st. He confirmed that Jerry had been shot 3 times, beaten, and an attempt had been made to strangle him. However, he was puzzled by marks on the right side of Jerry's neck and cheek. These were not the characteristic muzzle imprints of a point-blank gunshot wound. The medical examiner was unable to determine what had caused these mysterious marks. However, for Jerry's family, his murder was no mystery. Doug Boggs told the police that he knew exactly who was responsible. He pleaded with the police to question Jerry's ex-wife, Jill Coit. Doug's suspicions had been aroused 2 years earlier when Jill claimed she was pregnant. His brother was in love and believed everything Jill said. Concerned, Jerry's relatives contacted a friend who was a private detective and asked her to investigate Jill's background. What the detective uncovered was a completely different Jill than the one Jerry knew. With each new detail, the detective was more and more astounded. She even had difficulty determining Jill's birth year because Jill Coit had 4 birth certificates, 3 social security numbers, and at least 15 different identities she had used over the past 25, 30 years. By the time Jill met Jerry, he was potentially husband number 8. Jill Lanita Billiot was born in Louisiana. She had a tumultuous relationship with her brother, which led her to leave home at 15 and move in with her grandparents in Indiana. Local boys were captivated by her southern accent. One such admirer was 18-year-old Larry Eugene Einen. Evidently, the attraction was mutual because at 17, Jill dropped out of school and married him. The marriage dissolved quickly, within a couple of months. And when Jill left her young husband, she took the only thing he had, $280 earned from his masonry assistant job. Interestingly, divorce at that time required stating a reason. Larry cited cruel and inhumane treatment, while Jill requested a restraining order against him. What exactly transpired between the young couple remains unknown, but Jill was determined not to work a modest factory job. She decided to complete her education and returned to Louisiana to attend acting classes at the university. For 3 years, she managed to focus on her studies, at least not marrying anyone. However, she eventually married another student, Stephen Moore. Unfortunately, even the birth of their son, Seth, could not save their marriage. Jill left Stephen and moved to Texas with their son. Despite how her approach to life and marriage would change in the future, she didn't gain much financially from her first 2 marriages. While fully aware of her value and attractiveness, Jill secured a job as a model. A beautiful girl caught the eye of successful engineer William Clark Coit Jr. He was unfazed by her 2 previous marriages and adopted Seth as his own son. Jill claimed that he was the love of her life. Despite her happy marriage to William, Jill didn't divorce her second husband until after the birth of her and William's first child. Their second son was born later. William had more resources than any of her previous husbands, which likely sparked Jill's attraction to substantial wealth, and she eagerly spent it. However, William was often away from home, leading Jill to start having affairs. Upon discovering this, William demanded a divorce. A bitter custody battle ensued. But 3 weeks before the divorce was finalized, tragedy struck. William Coit Jr. was murdered in his own home, shot 3 times in the back with a .22 caliber weapon. Detectives believed he knew his killer since he was shot from behind. Before his death, William had withdrawn a substantial amount of money from his accounts, telling friends he did so to prevent Jill from getting it. Unfortunately, he miscalculated. The money was never found, likely because Jill was the one who discovered William's body when he failed to show up for work. Naturally, the police suspected his 27-year-old widow, Jill. However, she managed to flee to New Orleans and hired a lawyer. On his advice, she admitted herself to a psychiatric hospital. This tactic worked, and the police were unable to question her. Without sufficient evidence to extradite her forcibly, Jill spent a year in the psychiatric facility. After her release, she reclaimed her 3 sons from relatives, secured the money she inherited from William, and moved to California to start anew. In California, Jill tried something new. She met Bruce Johansson, who was over 90 years old. Unable to marry him, she used her charm to persuade him to adopt her. After the man passed away, likely from natural causes, she inherited all his assets, finances, and property. She had no time to mourn because she was preparing for marriage number 4 with Major Donald Brody of the Marine Corps. However, Jill unexpectedly found out that her husband could refuse her access to his funds. Their relationship quickly deteriorated, so she resorted to another way to extract money from him. After a lengthy separation, she delighted him with news of giving birth to a boy named Thaddeus John Brody. The Major didn't believe her. She then showed him a fake birth certificate and asked acquaintances to lend her their child temporarily to show him a son, allegedly theirs. But unable to sustain this, a month later she delivered the major horrifying news. The child had died and she buried him in the family crypt. Fortunately, it was a lie, and when the crypt was later opened, there was no child inside. Realizing she could no longer gain anything from the major, Jill divorced him and married a man named Louis A. DeRosa. He was a lawyer she hired after fleeing following the death of her third husband, William. He also assisted her in Bruce Johansson's adoption. Their relationship was tumultuous, with the couple divorcing and reconciling 2-3 times over many years. During one of their separations, Jill managed to marry husband number 6, Eldon Dwayne Metzger, an auction organizer. This marriage was very short and illegal because she divorced Louis DeRosa in Haiti, a divorce not recognized in the USA. Thus, she was still legally married to Louis when she moved to Indiana and met her 7th husband. 2 of her sons attended school in Indiana, where one of the boys' school director was Carl V. Steele. Jill lived with him for 7 years, which were some of the longest and most normal relationships in her life. Carl treated her and the boys well. He loved skiing and often took the family to Steamboat Springs, Colorado. They enjoyed their time there and dreamed of growing old together in that place. During one of their trips, the couple decided to invest in a business by purchasing a small hotel. Jill convinced Carl that she would handle everything herself because he was a teacher, and she felt more capable of managing finances. The plan was for Jill to move to Steamboat Springs, buy the hotel in both their names, renovate it with their sons, and start managing it. Carl would join her when school holidays began. However, Carl encountered a very unpleasant surprise when he arrived in town. Jill simply ousted him. She persuaded him to say goodbye to his money, convinced him to invest in her business, and he was no longer needed. She registered the hotel under her and her elder son Seth's name only. Carl was left without money and in debt. After less than 10 years together, Jill and Carl parted ways. They didn't finalize their divorce before Jill set her sights on husband number 8, Jerry Bogs, the owner of a store in Steamboat Springs. Investigators found too many coincidences between the 2 murder cases of Jill's ex-husbands, William and Jerry. Both men were killed with the same caliber weapon, which was never recovered. In both cases, there was no forced entry into the home. Jill knew the layout of the rooms in the house, knew when Jerry would return home from work, and it would not have been difficult for her to catch William at home in the evening while he watched TV. But the similarities didn't end there. Jill had a financial motive in both crimes. However, when investigators talked to Jill, it turned out she had alibis. In the same month she annulled her marriage to Jerry, she finally divorced Carl Steele, so she was not married to anyone at the time. Perhaps a new feeling for her. Instead, she was dating a telephone technician named Michael Backus. During her conversation with investigators, Jill stated that she and Michael were camping in Poudre Canyon, 240 kilometers away from the crime scene. To set up a tent in that location, they had to fill out a form and pay a fee. This meant that Jill could prove she was in Poudre Canyon if needed. Therefore, she was too far away by the evening of October 21st to have killed Jerry. Investigators decided they needed to pinpoint the exact time frame when the attack on Jerry occurred. A crucial piece of evidence was studying the contents of his stomach. Jerry Bogs was a creature of habit. He opened his store at the same time every day. Then at 11 a.m., he went to a restaurant for breakfast where he always ate the same meal: hash browns, eggs, and toast. Specialists used plant cells, which, unlike protein-based foods, pass through the digestive system unchanged. They determined that Jerry had consumed onions. However, the restaurant chef did not add onions to the hash browns, eggs, or toast. This indicated that Jerry had indeed eaten his meal, meaning he was killed closer to the evening of October 21st, when Jill had an alibi. Thus, Jill had a motive, but no opportunity to kill him. If Jill didn't kill him, who did? Perhaps the unidentified hunters who had frightened Jerry's neighbor. However, the police had no leads on how to find them. Then, on a hunch, one of the investigators visited the restaurant where Jerry had breakfast and stood in the kitchen, observing the chef at work. He noticed that although the chef didn't add onions to the hash browns, he used the same spatula to mix them as he did with onions. This contamination could explain why onion particles were found in Jerry's system. It indicated that he was killed 3 hours after breakfast, a time frame during which Jill didn't have an alibi. Furthermore, the police couldn't find the form she supposedly filled out for the Poudre Canyon visit. This meant she hadn't been camping with her boyfriend and they had both lied. Interestingly, while the police awaited the results from Jerry's stomach contents, Jill managed to get married again, possibly for the last time. When unpleasant rumors began circulating about her in Steamboat Springs, she left for Las Vegas, where she seduced Roy Carroll, a retired Navy officer. However, before the end of the year, she left him and reunited with Michael Backus. According to some sources, she married him. Although no marriage certificate was found, she used his surname in any case. Meanwhile, gathering only circumstantial evidence, the police managed to obtain a search warrant for the suspect's car. Inside, they found maps of Mexico, a couple of wigs, and a stun gun. The discovery of the stun gun prompted the police to exhume Jerry's body to conduct several tests. It turned out that the marks on the victim's face matched those from this weapon. Additionally, the wigs found in Jill's car matched the description of the appearance of the two hunters observed by Jerry's neighbor on the day of his murder. However, the police were unable to arrest the accomplices because they had disappeared. The case would have stalled if not for unexpected assistance from a surprising source. Jill's eldest son, Seth. He called the police and revealed that his mother had asked him to help cover up Jerry's murder and dispose of the body. However, Seth liked Jerry and refused to assist. He informed the police that when the net started closing in on their associates, Jill and Michael traveled to California, crossed by boat from San Diego to Tijuana, then to Mexico City, and finally to Spain. Without Seth's cooperation, Jill might never have been apprehended. However, just a week later, she decided to return to the United States, where police officers tracked her down. Some speculate that she ran out of money. In any case, returning was an incredible risk, bringing her not only back to the country, but also to Steamboat Springs, where she drove around town in her own car, seemingly unfazed by the danger. On December 23, 1993, Jill and Michael were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Even during questioning, Jill behaved provocatively, attempting to flirt with detectives and vehemently asserting her innocence. She was nearly 50 years old, but had never faced serious legal consequences despite her numerous marriages without proper divorces, document forgery, identity theft, insurance fraud, and being a potential suspect in her third husband's murder. She firmly believed that money ruled the world and that she was untouchable. The trial began in 1995. One by one, witnesses took the stand, including Michael Backus's colleague, who testified that Jill and Michael had tried to persuade them to kill Jerry Bogs, citing false claims that he had harmed a young girl and deserved to die. However, Jerry was a respected member of society, and these claims did not hold up under scrutiny. Furthermore, after her breakup with Jerry, Jill posed as a psychologist, ostensibly helping flood victims. During one session, she asked a client for a gun and offered $1,000 to kill Jerry Bogs. Naturally, the client declined this shocking proposal, especially given the context of seeking professional help for trauma. This incident underscored Jill's audacious approach to manipulating others for her own ends. When their associates failed to find someone willing to commit the murder, Jill and Michael decided to take matters into their own hands. Michael and Jill fabricated a camping trip in the canyon. However, they used this as an opportunity to practice disguising themselves. On the appointed day, they walked the streets disguised as a pair of hunters. Jill wore a mustache, wig, beard, and men's clothing. Investigators believe their accomplices entered through the back door and waited for the victim, lying in wait. After Jerry finished work early and returned home around noon, the killers immobilized him using an electroshock gun. They then beat him with a shovel and attempted to strangle him. When that failed, according to detectives, Jill shot her ex-husband 3 times. Later, she called her son Seth and said, "It's over. It's very messy." As Seth testified in court, he knew she was referring to Jerry's murder. Indeed, his testimony proved crucial in convincing the jurors of the guilt of the accomplices. It took them 5 hours to convict both of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Each received a life sentence plus an additional 48 years for conspiracy, along with a $1 million fine. Clearly, the fine was intended to prevent them from profiting from any movie or book deals about their story. But even this didn't stop Jill. She advertised herself as a green card for anyone willing to marry her. When this project failed, in 2002, she claimed she was subjected to violence and abuse in prison, and her rights were violated. She alleged that a guard had assaulted her and broken her finger. Additionally, she claimed she was denied special orthopedic devices for arthritis. She attempted similar claims in 2006, but they were not believed. Despite filing appeals, all were rejected. Some might say living in marriage is like being in prison anyway. But for Jill Coit, this prison became a lifelong reality. Jill was furious with Jerry because he dared to stand in her way and thwarted her plans. Not only did he refuse to let her sell the hotel, but a private detective hired by his family had gathered enough evidence to expose her. Jerry intended to bring her to justice in court, revealing who she truly was and what she had done, so she couldn't deceive anyone else. However, like William, Jerry never got the chance to confront Jill face-to-face in court. Both men were killed just days before the trial was set to begin. The murder of Jill's third husband was never solved. Jerry died trying to stop a predator, paying a high price for the truth. While Jill had no trouble cycling through men in her life, she didn't easily let go of their money. For the money she believed rightfully hers, she fought to the death, literally in their deaths. In 1994, in the small town of New Haven in the state of New York, 18-year-old Heidi Allen was abducted from the store where she worked. Two brothers were accused of her kidnapping, but two separate trials led to paradoxical outcomes. All charges were dropped against one brother, while the other was found guilty. However, if you thought, well, at least they caught the guy who did it, by the end of this story, you'll likely change your opinion. On April 3, 1994, Easter Sunday, 18-year-old Heidi Allen began her shift at the convenience store attached to the D&W gas station in New Haven, a town in Oswego County, New York. Heidi was a determined and energetic young woman with ambitions of building a career in education or psychological counseling. Devoting much of her time to sports, her tall and robust build made her an invaluable member of volleyball and other teams. Despite her athletic prowess, she maintained a friendly demeanor, and everyone noted her warmth and responsiveness. Heidi had been working at D&W for over 2 years. It was her day off, but she agreed to cover a shift so that her colleague could spend the day with her children. Heidi's shift began at 5:45, and she arrived at work with her boyfriend. This was not unusual, as he often accompanied her to ensure she felt safe while opening the store very early in the morning. Typically, he would wait until the first customers arrived and then go about his day. That's exactly how it played out on April 3rd. Another customer entered the store but didn't see any staff. It might have seemed like the store was closed, but the gas pumps were operational and the lights were on inside. The customer went outside and flagged down a passing patrol car. Sheriff's deputies entered the store, finding everything seemingly in order. There was money in the cash register, and $9.50 was on the counter, left by another customer as payment for fuel and a newspaper. There were no signs of struggle or apparent issues. A security alarm was located under the counter, but it hadn't triggered that day. The officers discovered Heidi's car parked on the street, and her purse and car keys were still in the store. Despite the absence of signs of a struggle, the sheriff's deputies concluded that she might have been abducted, and the search for her began immediately. The state police offered assistance to the sheriff's office in Oswego County with the search for the missing girl. They had the resources to block all exits and ensure the abductor wouldn't escape. However, the sheriff inexplicably declined the offer, stating that his team could handle it on their own. Officers checked the punched receipts at the store's cash register and discovered that the last purchase was made at 7:42 when someone bought 2 packs of cigarettes. It was crucial to find this customer, as they were the last person to see the girl at work. Fortunately, the search for this individual didn't take much time. As soon as the news of Heidi's presumed abduction spread through the town, a man named Richard Thibodeau called the police. He claimed to be the one who was in the store that morning. The girl sold him cigarettes, and he left afterward. When extensive searches for the girl began, local residents, including Richard Thibodeau, his brother Gary, and his wife Teresa, joined in. Around the same time, Christopher Bivens contacted the police, describing how he drove past the store and saw 2 men leading a tall young woman toward a van. He thought one of the men was holding the woman tightly. He admitted he didn't remember the appearance of the van or the men, but noted that they were quite tall. Despite Richard Thibodeau voluntarily contacting the police and assisting in the search for the girl, law enforcement grew suspicious of him due to the timing of his purchase, just minutes before the concerned customer approached the sheriff's deputies. Additionally, he drove a van similar to the one described by Christopher. The police searched Richard's van, but nothing connecting the vehicle or its owner to Heidi was found. Richard willingly provided his fingerprints, blood samples, and hair without objection. Due to suspicions surrounding Richard, investigators turned a closer eye to his brother, Gary Thibodeau. After all, Christopher Bivens saw 2 men taking the young woman out of the store. Gary explained to detectives that he was still sleeping at home that early morning. and his girlfriend confirmed his alibi. A month later, the police charged Richard Thibodeau with the abduction. Gary was also taken into custody, albeit for a different minor offense unrelated to Heidi's disappearance. While he was in jail, law enforcement managed to build a case against the brothers. Suddenly, 2 inmates emerged, claiming that Gary had said Heidi was no more and she would never be found. Thus, detectives arrested a man who had voluntarily called the police and reported being in the store that morning. Despite no evidence against him, Richard willingly provided all the necessary samples and underwent a polygraph test. However, it seemed to have little significance. Richard and his brother Gary, a person with an alibi, were charged with first-degree kidnapping. A jury trial was conducted separately for Gary Thibodeau. During the trial, no concrete evidence or forensic testimony was presented, and Heidi was still missing. However, the prosecution was confident in their case. They called a witness who had seen 2 men with a girl near the store that morning, and jury members heard the statements of 2 inmates regarding Gary's alleged remarks about Heidi. Although the information provided by the 2 convicted individuals contradicted not only each other, but also established facts at that time, they were allowed to testify in court. The jurors heard that Heidi disappeared within just 13 minutes between the last recorded cigarette sale and the arrival of sheriff's deputies at the store. During these 13 minutes, the witness saw 2 men leading the young woman to a car. He described the vehicle as a white van with 2 dark blue or black doors at the back and 2 doors of the same color on the right side, along with a wide 6-inch black stripe above the wheels. The same witness, Christopher Bivens, identified the van as the one driven by Richard. However, it's crucial to note the interesting evolution in the testimony of this key prosecution witness. Initially, he could hardly recall anything about the men or the van where Heidi was supposedly placed. Suddenly, he could remember minute details, and the height of the men decreased to match the Thibodeau brothers' heights. Another customer from the store was called to testify. He made a purchase at 7:41, just a minute before Richard bought 2 packs of cigarettes. The man explained that there was a running van in the parking lot, and he assumed it was Richard's. He saw Richard in the store and, for some reason, believed there were 2 men in the van. Essentially, his testimony merely confirmed that Richard Thibodeau was in the store, a fact that Richard did not deny. A 13-year-old girl also provided testimony, claiming to have seen Richard's van parked at Gary's house shortly after Heidi Allen's disappearance. The girl insisted she remembered this because it was Easter Sunday. She had just woken up and looked out the window to see the van. However, after the trial, she recanted her statements, admitting that it could have been a dream. This constituted the evidence presented by the sheriff's deputies. The prosecutors had no concrete evidence linking the Thibodeau brothers to the abduction, no motive for the crime, and no logical explanation for why Richard Thibodeau would buy cigarettes if he intended to abduct the girl. Why not simply pocket the cigarettes when he and his brother allegedly took Heidi out of the store? Despite all this, Gary Thibodeau was found guilty of first-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole. During Richard's trial, nearly all the same evidence was presented, except for the testimony of the 2 inmates. However, since a different judge presided over the case, and there were different jurors, the outcome of the trial turned out to be entirely different. All charges against Richard were dropped. Richard returned to his family, while Gary began serving his sentence in prison. Gradually, the case of Heidi Allen's abduction began to fade from memory until an unexpected turn occurred in February 2013. A woman named Tanya Priest called the police, claiming she needed to unburden her conscience. She recounted a conversation that took place in 2006 when she gave a ride to her friend Victoria West to the trailer home where she lived with her boyfriend James Steen. The couple invited her inside, and as they chatted about random topics, a news segment about Heidi aired on TV. The girls started discussing what might have happened to her when James suddenly said, "Do you really want to know?" and began his story. It was the last thing the girls expected to hear. Steen revealed that he, along with 2 friends, Roger Breckenridge and Michael Borer, had abducted Heidi that day, taking her out of the store and putting her into Michael Borer's van. Borer was waiting in the van, meaning that 2 men took the girl out of the store, just as witness Christopher Bivens had claimed. The men then drove Heidi to the trailer home of Breckenridge's girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott, on Rice Road in the town of Mexico, Oswego County. Steen added that they had long gotten rid of that van, but the body could still be found in a shed in the woods across from where the trailer had been located. When asked why they had committed such a grave act, Steen explained that Heidi was planning to report to the police their involvement in illegal drug trafficking. At first, the friends didn't believe Steen, thinking he wouldn't harm a fly. However, a few years later, when Steen killed his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, who happened to be his cousin, out of jealousy, Tanya Priest was no longer sure that Steen was so harmless. Interestingly, the police initially hesitated to believe Tanya Priest's words, but she was determined not to give up, and the officers eventually yielded to her persistent requests to investigate this version. They assisted Tanya in secretly recording a phone conversation with Roger Breckenridge's ex-girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott. In the phone conversation, Westcott admitted knowing about what happened to Heidi Allen and went so far as to say that the men didn't bring the abducted girl into her trailer, but left her in the van. However, when sheriff's deputies questioned Jennifer and presented her with the recording, she evaded and claimed she just wanted to quickly end the conversation with Tanya, agreeing with everything she said. During a polygraph test, she lied about knowing who abducted Heidi Allen. Despite this information, law enforcement did not actively pursue the case. At this point, Tanya reached out to Gary Thibodeau's lawyer because by then, she was convinced of his innocence and wanted to help him secure his release. It's worth noting that the main problem in this case has always been the motive behind the crime. It's entirely unclear why the Thibodeau brothers would kidnap a girl they barely knew. Similarly, the motive for three men to take such a heavy burden upon themselves remains unclear. However, it turns out that such a motive could exist, and law enforcement authorities did not want the truth to come to light. Heidi Allen, an 18-year-old employee at the gas station convenience store, had been a police informant for 3 years. 3 years ago, the girl got into trouble when she was caught by the police during a party her sister wanted to attend. As she was a minor and had put a child who was with her in the car in a dangerous situation, Heidi faced significant problems. In exchange for dropping all charges, the 15-year-old girl made a deal and became a police informant. Although she was a confidential informant, her status was revealed by a bizarre accident. Before she disappeared, Heidi worked with a sheriff's assistant, Chris Van Patten, who accidentally dropped her informant card with a photo and the codename Julia Roberts near the store where she worked. The card was found by Heidi's colleague, Kristen Duell, who returned it to the police. Kristen claimed that she only told her mother about it, but even if the girl told the truth, it is unknown how long the card lay on the ground and how many bystanders could see it. Inmates who testified in court against Gary Thibodeau claimed that Heidi was worried about Gary because he was planning to involve her in illegal dealings with controlled substances. However, firstly, one of these inmates later recanted his statement. Secondly, Heidi's diary was found, where she detailed her life, and there was not a single mention of the Thibodeau brothers. Thirdly, the information that Heidi was, in fact, an informant, allows for the dismissal of these baseless insinuations. The newly revealed information provided an alternative theory about Heidi's abduction, especially considering that her status was compromised, and dangerous people could have learned that she worked for the police. Considering the new details, in 2014, after persistent demands from Gary's lawyers, searches were conducted in 2 cabins in the woods. One was literally opposite the place where Jennifer Westcott lived. Search dogs indicated the potential presence of remains near the cabin. Police found fresh shoe tracks at the site, and inside it was evident that someone had already dismantled the floorboards. However, the forensic examination conducted by the Bureau of Forensic Services did not detect any human remains. It's interesting that when Tanya Priest decided to share what she knew, numerous witnesses from the town immediately came forward, claiming to have heard James Steen, Michael Borer, and Roger Breckenridge boasting about Heidi's abduction. Some of these witnesses asserted that they had reported this to the police on multiple occasions. Even the key prosecution witness, Christopher Bivens, stated that Steen and Breckenridge looked much more like the individuals leading the girl out of the store. However, as he had never seen their photos before, he considered the Tibbet brothers as possible abductors. Around the same time, it was revealed that in 2004, Heidi's cousin, Melissa Searles, found an envelope in her mailbox containing a gold bracelet she had once gifted to Heidi. The envelope had no postage stamp, indicating that it wasn't sent through the mail, but was personally placed in the mailbox. Melissa claimed that she had not reported this discovery to the police for years because the entire family believed Heidi's abductor was already in prison, and there was no need to reopen the case. However, with the new abduction theory, she apparently felt compelled to share this information. In 2015, the appeal process regarding Gary's accusation began. The defense insisted on a new trial due to a wealth of newly revealed information. 52 witnesses, including 3 considered potential new suspects, testified. A key witness was a woman who drove past the D&W store around 6 a.m. on April 3, 1994. She reported seeing an old, rust-covered van with no black stripe down the middle, confirming that it wasn't Richard Thibodeau's van. The defense tried to argue that the 3 men kidnapped the girl, forcing her into Michael Bohr's van, and took her to a cabin in the woods because they feared she would report them to the police. The men, of course, denied everything, but Michael Bohr slipped up by mentioning seeing Heidi's informant card near the store. Furthermore, Bohr told law enforcement that he wasn't a cruel person, so he couldn't have committed such a crime. However, this was untrue. Michael Bohr had previously been accused of kidnapping a young girl, making him, unlike the Thibodeau brothers, capable of such a crime. What's intriguing is that he was obsessed with this case, collecting a whole box of materials related to Heidi's abduction. One entry in his notes was particularly intriguing. He wrote as if a psychic told him that Heidi hid the bracelet behind the car seat. She added that Heidi hid an item where she was held, and all her family members would recognize it. Despite the abundance of new information, Gary lost the appeal after a year of hearings, and he was denied the opportunity for a new trial. From 2015 to 2018, subsequent judicial decisions also prohibited presenting new evidence due to doubts about the reliability of witnesses and the lack of sufficient proof to substantiate the alleged confessions of the 3 men. None of the 3, James Stein, Michael Bohr, or Roger Breckenridge, were charged in connection with Heidi's disappearance. Perhaps if Gary's lawyers had known about another crucial lead, they might have persuaded the judge to allow a new trial. The prosecutor informed the defense that he had provided them with all case materials. However, on December 13, 1994, he explicitly prohibited copying documents from a specific folder for the defense attorneys. Inside were 2 letters from the globally renowned expert in determining truthfulness, Murray Myron. His services were often sought by FBI agents, and he was asked to speak with a witness who might be the one who saw Heidi after her abduction. The expert concluded that Brent Moore's account of specific events related to Heidi was truthful and accurate. He did witness her being transported in a van, and she found refuge in a garage on the Barlow property in the town of Scriba. Brent was only 3 years old at the time of Heidi's abduction, and the expert was invited to verify whether the boy was telling the truth about the events of that day. The expert talked to the child, analyzed his drawings, and believed him. He advised looking for Heidi where the boy indicated. Interestingly, Brent knew Heidi before the abduction. His mother mentioned that during the Christmas holidays, after a visit to Richard Mitten, the boy's father, Brent mentioned seeing Heidi and that she gave money to Richard. When shown a photo of Heidi, the boy immediately recognized her and called her by name. Additionally, he accurately described her car. Brent added that 3 friends of his father were involved in Heidi's abduction, and the boy's mother remembered a conversation with her ex-husband on Easter Sunday in 1994, the day Heidi disappeared. She recalled how Richard suddenly claimed that 3 boys had kidnapped her. Who they were and whether they knew that Heidi was an informant is unknown. Investigators attempted to search the garage indicated by the boy, but couldn't conduct the search on either the garage or the adjacent area due to the lack of a warrant, and the homeowner did not allow the search. As evident, there are several theories about what might have happened to Heidi Allen besides the police's version implicating the Tibbets brothers. It's possible that Stein, Breckenridge, and Bohr were the kidnappers, or perhaps friends of Brent Moore's father were involved. Since the girl was not found, there's also a more optimistic version suggesting that she entered a witness protection program. What if the police realized the danger they put Heidi in by making a teenager a confidential informant and then compromising her status? This could explain many unexplained aspects of the case. The appearance of her bracelet, the lack of signs of struggle in the store, the absence of evidence clearly pointing to any of the suspects. One might want to believe that she had to leave her family, but no one kidnapped her, and she is enjoying life somewhere in this world. Although one thing can be asserted almost certainly, When the sheriff's assistant dropped Heidi's informant card, he put an end to the life she had led until the age of 18. What truly happened on the morning of Sunday, April 3, 1994, remains unknown. It's possible that we may never find out. What we do know is that Gary maintained his innocence until his last breath. Gary Thibodeau passed away on August 12, 2018, at the age of 64, and his health did not allow him to live the additional 2 years to a potential conditional early release. Gary's departure means he will no longer have a chance to clear his name. Hope for another appeal in federal court died with him. He will remain a convicted inmate who abducted an 18-year-old girl and, according to many, is the second victim of this terrible and convoluted crime. On March 1, 2011, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Gisela Daoud heard her phone ringing. An unknown number appeared on the screen. It was a police officer from the city of Valence asking if she was the mother of Samira Ben-Saad. She answered yes. Gisela couldn't understand why the police were looking for her 20-year-old daughter, Samira. She hadn't seen her for 3 days. The woman demanded an explanation of what was happening, but the police response did not calm her at all. The caller stated that they were searching for Samira because her boyfriend, 22-year-old Maël Combia, had gone missing. The police had discovered that the young couple had been dating for 8 months. However, Gisela knew nothing about the guy. Samira and Maël had met at a party. Samira Ben-Saad was a very beautiful woman who was aware of her attractiveness. She wanted to become a model and loved posing for photographs. Maël, in turn, was also a very nice and pleasant young man. There was an immediate mutual attraction between them, and they started seeing each other. However, on February 28, 2011, at 9:45 p.m., Maël's boss from the construction company contacted the police. He was worried because he hadn't heard from his employee for 3 days. On Saturday morning, the guy came to work, and then his phone rang. He quickly got up and left without any explanation, and no one had seen him since. On Monday morning, his boss was surprised that he still hadn't shown up. They considered him a punctual and responsible employee, and it was the first time he didn't come to work. His boss found out that Maël wasn't answering calls from colleagues and friends, so he decided to contact the police. First, the police went to the guy's home in the city center of Valence, but it yielded no results because no one answered the doorbell. His car was not at the house either. On the same evening, the police talked to Maël's mother. She hadn't received any news from her son for 3 days and added that during their last meeting, he had behaved very unusually, being extremely emotional and tense. The woman mentioned that her son hugged and kissed her and said he loved her, something he had never done before. The details uncovered by the investigators seemed very suspicious. Maël and Samira disappeared on the same day without explaining anything to anyone and had not contacted their families for 3 days. It couldn't be a coincidence. One clue came from examining their phones. The investigators found out that Samira and Maël didn't just leave at the same time, but they left together in Maël's car. The phone pings revealed that on Saturday, in the middle of the day, they headed to Nice, and in the evening, they checked into a luxury hotel on the promenade. The investigators contacted the hotel and learned that there were surveillance cameras capturing 2 guys and a woman. The description perfectly matched Samira and Maël. They left Nice on Sunday morning and arrived in Livorno, 400 kilometers east of the border between France and Italy, by the evening. The young couple was clearly heading further into Italy, and the French police sought assistance from their Italian colleagues. Maël had booked a room in a prestigious hotel in Livorno. The hotel staff confirmed that a guy and a woman matching the description of the missing couple had stayed with them. So, Saturday evening was spent in Nice, and the next day they headed to Livorno. Everything indicated that Samira and Maël had embarked on a spontaneous romantic journey, especially considering that the Riviera was conducive to such adventures. The detectives believed that the young couple would soon return home together, and they had no reason to doubt this theory, especially since Samira's mother received a message from her daughter stating that she had left but there was no need to worry because she would return soon. It seemed like it should have been another confirmation that everything was fine with the young couple,
but Gazella was certain that her daughter would never disappear just by impulsively leaving for a trip. Samira was a responsible woman who never missed work. There was another detail that troubled Gazella. She couldn't understand how her daughter, who loved being photographed and never left the house without meticulously applied makeup, styled hair, and carefully chosen clothes, could go away for several days with a young man without taking any belongings with her. She was also puzzled by the fact that Samira sent an SMS. The thing is, she would usually just call her mother. They were close and could talk for hours, so receiving a text message didn't calm her down. Instead, it only worried her even more. The next news about the case came from the city of Imperia, located in northern Italy, approximately 80 kilometers from Nice. On Monday, March 3, 2011, Massimo Bessone was on his way to work when he turned onto a small street to take a shortcut. Along the road, he noticed something strange. At first, he thought he saw a mannequin, but when he opened the door, he realized it was a woman. Massimo shouted something but received no response. However, the woman was clearly moving. He quickly called for an ambulance. Italian police determined that she was the missing French woman. Someone had shot her in the back of the head, and the bullet had lodged in her skull. The theory of a romantic trip could now be discarded. The French police were perplexed. Initially, it was a case of suspicious disappearance, then they thought it was a love-related escape, but now they were dealing with a girl who had been wounded in an attempted murder. Samira was alive but in critical condition. She was immediately taken to the hospital, and her mother was informed. When Gazella arrived at the hospital, she didn't even recognize her own daughter at first. It's difficult to describe the sight. Samira's head was shaved bald, and she resembled a 9-year-old child. The woman refused to believe that her daughter ended up in Italy with a bullet in her head. The doctors told the mother that there was little hope since the bullet was lodged in her daughter's skull. But Gazella didn't want to accept that and arranged for Samira to be transported to a hospital in Marseille. There, a surgeon informed her directly that he would perform the operation but wouldn't provide false hope. Even if the patient survived, she would never fully recover. Samira underwent a 10-hour operation. Although she made it through the surgery, when she opened her eyes, she didn't recognize anyone and couldn't speak. She had to relearn everything like a young child. While Samira couldn't tell anything about what happened in Italy, the police had to search for the culprit without her testimony. Many indications pointed to the crime being planned. She was found lying on the side of the road near a landfill, and the Italian police couldn't find any of her belongings. There was no purse, no phone, no passport. This indicated that the perpetrator wanted her to remain unidentified. However, the investigators had a lead. The last person Samira was seen with was her boyfriend, Maël Combia. The police believed that Maël crossed the border into Italy to commit the crime and then fled. However, he made a mistake by using his bank card in France after Samira was found. He used it at a first-class hotel in Les Tourrex, just 35 kilometers from his apartment in Valence. Surveillance cameras showed that Maël had returned to France a day earlier. But if he was innocent, why didn't he go home to his family? Instead, he stayed in a hotel just a few kilometers away. Soon, he made another mistake. Investigators discovered that he had used Samira's credit card. In other words, the young couple embarked on a spontaneous trip to another country where the woman nearly died, and Maël stayed in a hotel and used her card. Everything confirmed the police's worst suspicions. To search for a motive, the detective spoke with the family and friends of the young man. It became clear that Samira and Maël's relationship was far from perfect. Samira was a very beautiful woman, and many men showed interest in her, which bothered Maël. Their arguments often escalated into physical violence. Maël could slap Samira in front of their friends, and there was even an incident where he extinguished a cigarette on her. Obviously, he couldn't be considered a very stable person, but the question of the motive remained open. Did Maël act in a fit of rage, or was everything planned in advance? All their friends knew that Samira was infatuated with Maël despite his behavior. However, She recently found out that her boyfriend was married. He had gotten married to his girlfriend at the age of 18 and frequently cheated on her. Samira was far from being his only mistress. She was angered by the revelation but didn't break up with him because she believed Maël's claim that they were in the process of divorce and living separately. Upon discovering this, the investigator went to Maël's home. But as soon as he entered, he realized that Samira was mistaken and the husband and wife were clearly living together. Furthermore, Maël was soon to become a father. The apartment had 17 ultrasound photos with the name Combia written on them. It was evident that Maël, his wife, and Samira were involved in a love triangle, and one of them was destined to disappear. It was necessary to find Maël, and it turned out to be much easier than the police had anticipated. Maël Combia surrendered himself 5 days after the disappearance, appearing at the Valence police station on March 4th. This was an incredible stroke of luck for the investigation. Maël not only came to the station voluntarily but also directly confessed that he was the one who shot Samira. He then proceeded to recount what had happened. The young man claimed that Samira was just an acquaintance with whom he could spend pleasant time. Their relationship had no future, and she knew it. Maël explained that their romance had come to an end, but Samira couldn't accept it. She didn't give him a moment's peace, constantly calling him and sometimes dialing his number 150 times in a single day. He showed the investigator his phone, which displayed evidence that Samira had called him approximately 1,000 times in a month. Maël's words confirmed that Samira's behavior could be classified as stalking. But could this be considered a justification for shooting her? Soon, the situation escalated to the point where the young man feared for his life. He recounted what happened on the Friday evening before their departure to Italy. Samira confronted him in a nightclub while he was kissing another woman. She stormed out of the club, scratched his car with her key, and they began arguing, which escalated into a fight with Samira's cousins. This incident terrified Maël because they claimed to have weapons and threatened to kill him. Maël was in a panic. He quickly got into his car and left the nightclub, deciding that he needed to come up with a way to protect himself in the future. The idea of acquiring a weapon for his own defense crossed his mind. The next day, when he received the call, he impulsively left and went to buy a revolver. However, all of this still didn't explain why he shot Samira. Maël explains that he didn't go to Italy to kill her or commit any other terrible act. He simply wanted to put an end to their troubled relationship. He drove Samira to Italy to calm down their heated emotions and explain everything to her. But things didn't go as planned. They argued again in the car, and Maël got out. Samira followed him. According to Maël, he grabbed the weapon with the intention of scaring her but had no intention to shoot. However, the revolver went off accidentally. Afterward, he left her lying on the ground, got back into the car, and drove away. When asked why he didn't call for an ambulance, he said he was scared when she fell. He went into hiding for several days because he didn't know what to do. The rest of the story was already known to the police. Overall, the man claims that he was the victim of his obsessive lover's pursuit, and what happened in Italy was an accident. He was arrested for attempted murder, but his explanation didn't fully convince the police. Some pieces didn't fit together. Why would someone travel to another country and stay in a luxury hotel just to end a relationship? Why did he take all her personal belongings and then use her credit card? And who sent the message to Samira's mother from her daughter's phone? The investigator had no doubt that the young man was lying, but it was difficult to prove without Samira's testimony. Fortunately, over time and with therapy, Samira was able to provide her testimony. At first, with a weak voice and very slowly, Samira began to speak. On October 11, 2011, 8 months after the attack, she recounted her version of events. Samira's words contradicted the claims of her former lover. He came to her home, stating that they needed to talk. She didn't want to, but he insisted, so she relented. Maël invited her for a weekend getaway. She asked where he wanted to go, and he replied, Spain.
This didn't sit well with her, so he took her to Nice instead, and from there, they went to Italy. After 2 days of leisure, on the third day of the trip, Maëlle unexpectedly veered off the road. When asked why he turned onto a road leading to a landfill, he reassured her not to worry because he simply needed to dispose of something. Maëlle stopped the car and got out. He opened the passenger side door for her to exit and retrieved a revolver. Pointing it at her, he declared that she would die. "Shoot if you're a man," she exclaimed, and he fired the gun. On February 7, 2012, a year after the attack on Samira, forensic experts found the revolver, and this discovery completely refuted Maëlle's claims. According to his version, the gun in his hand unexpectedly went off. However, ballistic analysis showed that such an event could not have occurred. The expert explained that before firing, the shooter needs to carefully prepare, pull the trigger back and then shoot, which involves 2 distinct actions. You cannot simply wave your hand for the revolver to fire. Furthermore, to pull the trigger of the revolver backward, one needs to hold the weapon with one hand and apply significant force to accomplish the action with the other hand. Accidentally firing such a firearm was utterly impossible. Maëlle Combia lied. He wanted to kill Samira, and after several months of investigation, detectives were able to reconstruct the plan that the murderer had conceived. On February 26, 2011, at 9 a.m., Maëlle left work. He was determined to avoid a repeat of the previous night's scene at all costs, so he purchased a weapon. Heading to the woods, he tested it, loaded it, pulled the trigger, and fired. He had planned everything. After a romantic weekend in Italy, Samira was supposed to disappear on the other side of the border. Italy served as the perfect country to commit the crime since he had no connections there. Driving off the road, Maëlle pulled the woman out of the car, declared he would kill her, and shot her. Then he took her belongings to prevent her identification. Returning to France, Maëlle attempted to mislead the police by sending an SMS to Samira's mother. Everyone was supposed to believe that the woman had gone on a trip and was still alive. The guy believed he had committed the perfect crime and was confident that he would never be caught. Imagine his surprise when he discovered that his victim had survived. While the police were searching for him, he spent 5 days hiding near his hometown, contemplating his next actions. He lacked the means and useful connections to escape, so he devised a new strategy for self-defense. Maëlle Combia decided to go to the police and present his version of events. On February 10, 2014, the trial of Maëlle began in the city of Valence. The trial was a real ordeal for the victim and her family. To their immense surprise, Maëlle did not deviate from his version of events. He insisted that he was the victim in this case, and Samira had been harassing him, and everything that happened in Italy was an unfortunate accident. His friends stated that he had never been an aggressive person and purchased the revolver out of fear after threats from Samira's cousins, who had threatened to destroy his apartment, car, and kill Maëlle himself. He hid nothing and went on a trip to Italy in his own car, taking his phone with him. He simply wanted to take the woman on a trip to calm her down, as he was emotionally exhausted from Samira's constant call. It is also worth noting that Maëlle conducted himself with exaggerated politeness and respect during the trial, effortlessly charming the jury, and his strategy paid off. He was sentenced to 13 years of imprisonment. The lenient sentence made many wonder if there was a connection between Maëlle's behavior in court and the relatively short duration of the sentence chosen by the jury. After all, people often associate criminals with unpleasant personalities, and it is difficult for them to convict a charming young man with excellent manners. Samira considers this punishment too lenient, as by the time he turns 40, he will be a free man, able to live a normal life, while she will forever remain bound to a wheelchair simply because she loved a man who decided to kill her. The surgeon explained that during 1 year of therapy, Samira regained 80% of her abilities, after which the effectiveness of rehabilitation sharply declined, leaving her dependent on the help of others for the rest of her life. She admits that she was willing to do anything for love, and this is how he repaid her.